One daughter is a doctor, and the other is a maid my mother toasted at Thanksgiving, laughing with 18 people present. And when my mother tried to toast my sister again, what I said next made the entire table freeze. I am Gwen, 33 years old, and today I watched my family dig their own financial graves. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Westchester, New York, meant living in a world where appearances were absolutely everything. Our family home was a sprawling estate with perfectly manicured lawns, grand white columns, and a wide driveway lined with imported luxury cars. But inside those expensive walls, the atmosphere was always suffocating. My mother, Cynthia, was obsessed with status. She spent her entire life trying to climb the social ladder, desperately needing her wealthy friends to believe we were part of the elite. My father, William, was a hypocrite who enabled her behavior to protect his own networking. To them, children were not people to be loved. We were simply trophies to be displayed. If you did not shine brightly enough to reflect well on them, you were discarded permanently. 10 years ago, I made the unforgivable mistake of dropping out of medical school. The pressure, the toxicity, and the utter lack of passion for the field had broken me. When I left, I had absolutely nothing. To survive, I started cleaning houses. My family was horrified. They called me a disgrace, an embarrassment, and the family maid. They cut me off completely, acting as though my very existence was a stain on their perfect image. They had no idea that my small cleaning business eventually evolved into property management, and then into Oasis Holdings, a private equity firm managing luxury real estate developments and a massive medical network on the East Coast. Today, I am the self-made founder and CEO of a multi-million-dollar empire. But tonight, I was perfectly content playing the part of the family disappointment. The dining room was a masterclass in performative wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the massive mahogany table. 18 guests were seated, a mix of extended family and my father's wealthy business partners. Silver cutlery clinked against fine china, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey, expensive wine, and cheap arrogance. I sat quietly near the end of the table wearing a simple, understated dress that actually cost more than my mother's entire outfit, though she lacked the refined taste to realize it. Across from me sat my older sister, Allison. At 35, she was a dermatologist and my mother's ultimate golden child. Allison was haughty, cruel, and loved nothing more than stepping on others to elevate herself. Beside her sat her husband, Terrence. Terrence was a handsome African-American man who worked as a director of sales for a large medical supply company. He was intensely materialistic and deeply arrogant. Terrence desperately craved my parents' approval, and he quickly learned that the easiest way to earn it was by joining in on their relentless mockery of me. They were the perfect power couple in my parents' eyes. I quietly sipped my sparkling water, observing the theater unfolding around me. My mother was holding court, loudly bragging about her exclusive country club memberships and upcoming European vacations. Every word out of her mouth was calculated to impress the business partners seated around the table. My father nodded along, pouring $1,000 wine and laughing at jokes that were not funny. It was pathetic, really. Real wealth does not need to scream for attention. Real power does not need to beg to be noticed. But my family was so insecure, so desperate for validation that they performed their wealth like circus animals. Earlier that evening, I had parked a rented Toyota sedan at the end of the driveway. I deliberately left my chauffeured Maybach back at my penthouse in Manhattan. The Toyota was a highly strategic choice. I knew exactly how my family operated, and I wanted to give them the bait. When I handed my mother a bottle of wine at the door, she looked past me to the driveway, scoffed at the rental car, and loudly asked if I needed gas money to get back to my little apartment. Terrence laughed, adjusting his flashy gold watch, and muttered something about how parking my car too close to his sports car might bring down its property value. I did not react. I just smiled, the calm, patient smile of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a trap. As the first course was cleared away, the noise level rose. The 18 guests engaged in overlapping conversations about stock portfolios, exclusive private schools, and luxury real estate. I listened carefully, gathering intelligence. I heard Terrence bragging to one of my father's investors about a massive new contract he had just signed. I heard Allison complaining about her clinic staff, calling them incompetent peasants. I sat in silence, absorbing every detail. My quiet confidence stood in stark contrast to their desperate need for validation. I did not need to boast about my bank accounts. I knew exactly who I was, what I had built, and the immense power I held. I knew that with one phone call, I could dismantle the foundations of their arrogant lives. But I was not ready to end the game just yet. I wanted them to feel completely comfortable. I wanted them to climb as high as possible on their pedestal of superiority, because the higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be. And tonight, I was going to make sure they hit rock bottom, and finally realized that their so-called family maid was the one holding all the real power over their heads. The serving staff moved silently around the perimeter of the room, placing plates of roasted pheasant truffle, mashed potatoes, and perfectly seared asparagus in front of the guests. The clatter of heavy silver cutlery against fine porcelain briefly drowned out the hum of pretentious conversations. I maintained my quiet posture at the far end of the table, blending into the background exactly as they expected me to. Suddenly, my mother stood up at the head of the table. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against her crystal champagne flute. The clear, ringing sound cut through the dining room, demanding immediate and absolute silence from everyone present. Conversations halted mid-sentence. All 18 faces turned toward Cynthia, waiting for her grand performance to begin. If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment, she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and practiced elegance. She held her glass high, her expensive diamond bracelets catching the light from the massive chandelier overhead. Thanksgiving is a time to reflect on our blessings, and William and I have been blessed abundantly, particularly when it comes to the extraordinary success of our family. Cynthia turned her gaze toward my older sister. Allison immediately adjusted her posture, puffing out her chest and offering the table a tight, arrogant smile. First, I want to raise a glass to my brilliant daughter, Allison. As many of you know, Allison has dedicated her life to the medical field. She understands that true excellence requires relentless ambition and unparalleled dedication. Next month, she will officially be named senior partner at the Hawthorne Dermatology Institute. For those who might not know, it is the most prestigious and exclusive private clinic in the entire state of New York. The guests nodded approvingly. Murmurs of admiration floated around the table. William's business partners raised their glasses in a salute to her achievement. Allison smiled modestly, though there was absolutely nothing modest about the cold calculation in her eyes. "Thank you, Mother," she said, her voice projecting clearly across the room. "It is simply a matter of outworking everyone else in the room. The corporate medical world is ruthless. You either secure the highest-paying clientele or you get left behind with the mediocre practitioners. I have spent years cultivating relationships with the right people, the wealthy elite who understand the value of premium care. The senior partners finally recognize that my personal client portfolio brings in the kind of massive revenue that sustains the entire clinic. I do not just treat patients, I generate wealth." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The Hawthorne Dermatology Institute. I knew the name very well. What Allison did not know, and what my mother certainly did not know, was that Oasis Holdings had aggressively targeted Hawthorne for a corporate buyout earlier that quarter. I had personally reviewed their financial statements. Allison was not getting promoted because of her groundbreaking medical skills. She was being considered for a partnership because she relentlessly upsold unnecessary, wildly overpriced cosmetic procedures to insecure housewives. It was highly profitable, yes, but entirely devoid of basic medical ethics. Cynthia beamed, clearly thrilled by Allison's ruthless corporate mindset. She then turned her attention to my brother-in-law. "And of course, we must also celebrate the incredible achievements of Terrence. Terrence represents the absolute peak of American corporate success. He understands the art of the deal better than anyone I know. Terence leaned back in his chair, swirling the expensive red wine in his glass with a practiced, arrogant motion. He wore a smug, self-satisfied grin that made my stomach turn. "I just do what needs to be done, Cynthia," he boasted loudly. "The medical supply industry is a literal shark tank. You either eat or you get eaten. I prefer to do the eating." Cynthia nodded enthusiastically. Terrence has just secured a massive multi-million-dollar exclusive contract to supply the largest hospital network on the East Coast, she announced, her voice raising in pitch with sheer excitement. He is single-handedly dominating the regional supply chain. William and I always knew Allison married a winner, a man who truly understands the value of high-level corporate synergy and aggressive market expansion. Terrence chuckled, a deep, booming sound that demanded everyone at the table look directly at him. "It is all about leverage," he explained to the captivated audience. "The executives at that hospital network thought they could negotiate with me. They thought they could bring in cheaper vendors to undercut my pricing. I walked into that boardroom, looked their procurement director dead in the eye, and told him he either signs the exclusive contract with my company today, or he loses access to the premium surgical equipment his top doctors demand. You have to play hardball. You have to show them who holds the real power. I practically own their procurement division now." They danced to my tune. I carefully set my fork down on my linen napkin, keeping my expression entirely blank. The East Coast hospital network he was loudly bragging about was Pinnacle Health. Oasis Holdings had acquired Pinnacle Health 2 years ago in a highly publicized merger. I was the chairwoman of the board for Pinnacle. I vividly remembered the vendor contract Terrence was referring to. My chief procurement director had specifically flagged Terrence's company for aggressive, borderline unethical sales tactics and inflated pricing models. I had allowed his contract to proceed temporarily only because I was planning a massive network-wide audit of all external vendors next month. I wanted to personally oversee the termination of bloated, overpriced contracts exactly like his. Terrence did not own anything. He was a low-level middleman acting like a kingmaker, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual billionaire chairwoman of the board was sitting at the other end of his Thanksgiving table, quietly eating her asparagus. The conversation around the table quickly devolved into a disgusting display of corporate elitism. My father leaned forward, pointing his silver fork directly at Terrence. "That is exactly the kind of aggressive capitalism this country needs," William declared loudly, making sure his wealthy partners were listening. "Too many people these days want handouts. They lack the grit, the grind, the sheer willpower to climb the corporate ladder. Success is a pure meritocracy. You have to trample over the weak to get to the C-suite. Allison and Terrence are proof that if you have superior genetics and a superior work ethic, you conquer the free market." One of my father's business partners, an aging real estate developer wearing far too much expensive cologne, raised his glass in agreement. "To Allison and Terrence, you are the embodiment of elite success. Knowing the right people, closing the big deals, maximizing profit margins, and leaving the bottom feeders entirely in the dust. Here is to dominating the corporate world." Terrence leaned over the table, speaking directly to the real estate developer with unearned authority. "The problem with the modern workforce is that nobody wants to put in the 80-hour weeks anymore. They want work-life balance. They want coddling. I tell my sales team, if you are sleeping, you are losing my money. If you are not networking at the country club on a Sunday morning, you do not belong in my division. I fired 3 junior associates last week simply because they complained about answering client emails at midnight. I do not employ weak people. I only employ apex predators." Allison chimed in, cutting her roasted pheasant with precise, aggressive motions. "It is the exact same culture in private medicine. I have medical residents whining about being tired after a 12-hour shift. I tell them to look at my lifestyle. You want the luxury sports cars, the gated suburban communities, the winter vacations to Aspen. Then you do not get to complain about exhaustion. You sacrifice your personal life for your financial portfolio. We are the top 1% because we absolutely refuse to settle for mediocrity." Cynthia nodded furiously, her eyes shining with manic pride. She looked around the long table, ensuring every single guest was properly awed by her family's financial and social dominance. "We are a family of visionaries," she proclaimed to the room. "We do not associate with failure. We do not tolerate complacency. We demand absolute excellence in everything we do, and we reap the massive rewards of our superior standards." I watched the entire spectacle with a detached clinical fascination. It was exactly like observing a group of loud, colorful peacocks strutting around a confined cage, completely unaware that the zoo was scheduled for demolition. They spoke about wealth and power using hollow buzzwords they had read in business magazines. They worshipped the cheap illusion of control. Terrence truly thought that bullying a low-level procurement manager made him a titan of industry. Allison genuinely thought that scamming insecure women into buying overpriced skin treatments made her a medical pioneer. My mother and father actually believed that hosting a dinner party with expensive wine made them American aristocracy. They were small, petty people playing a high-stakes game they did not even begin to understand. They believed success was defined by the brand of their watch or the zip code of their house. They had absolutely no concept of generational wealth, institutional power, or the kind of invisible, silent dominance that I wielded every single day. I took another bite of my meal, chewing slowly, as the arrogant laughter and self-congratulatory toasts washed over me. I let them talk. I let them inflate their massive egos until they were practically floating above the dining room chairs. I needed their arrogance to reach its absolute zenith before I shattered it completely. The self-congratulatory applause finally began to die down, but my mother remained standing. She raised her free hand, signaling that her grand performance was far from over. A hush fell over the dining room once again. Cynthia took a delicate sip of her champagne, her eyes sweeping across the long mahogany table before finally landing directly on me. The warmth completely vanished from her gaze, replaced by a cold, calculating gleam. She had built up her golden child, and now she needed a scapegoat to make the contrast absolute. And then Cynthia said, her voice dropping into a tone of exaggerated theatrical pity, "We have Gwen." All 18 faces turned in my direction. The sudden weight of their collective stares was meant to be suffocating. I did not shift in my seat. I did not look down. I simply met my mother's gaze with absolute stillness. "Gwen has always marched to the beat of her own drum," Cynthia continued, her words dripping with fake sympathy. While Allison spent her 20s grueling through medical school rotations and mastering the complexities of dermatology, Gwen chose a different path. She decided that higher education was simply too stressful, so she dropped out. She walked away from a prestigious medical program to push a mop and scrub other people's toilets. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room, mostly from the business partners, who were not quite sure how to react to such a blatant public humiliation. But Cynthia was not finished. She leaned forward, resting her knuckles on the edge of the table, making sure her voice projected to the farthest corners of the room. "It is the ultimate irony of parenting," Cynthia announced, her voice rising to a dramatic crescendo. "One daughter is a doctor, the other is a maid. God certainly knows how to test my patience." The delivery was perfectly timed, a rehearsed punchline designed for maximum devastation. For a split second, the room held its breath. Then the table erupted into cruel, unified laughter. The 18 guests, emboldened by my mother's complete lack of boundaries, let go of any polite restraint. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers and the expensive oil paintings lining the walls. Terrence laughed the loudest. His deep, booming guffaws dominated the room. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware rattle against the china. A maid, Terrence wheezed, wiping a dramatic tear from his eye. "Oh, Cynthia, you always know exactly how to call it like it is. I have to tell you, it takes real dedication to look at a medical degree and say, 'No thanks, I would rather smell like bleach for the rest of my life.'" Allison joined in, her high-pitched giggle cutting through the noise. "Honestly," Gwen Allison sneered across the table, "I do not know how you stand it. I touch wealthy clients' faces all day, and you touch their dirty bathroom tiles. But I suppose society needs people at the bottom to keep the floors clean for the rest of us." The real estate developer seated near my father shook his head, raising his glass in a mock salute. It just proves what William was saying earlier, the developer chuckled. Success is entirely genetic, but sometimes the gene pool skips a generation. You simply cannot force ambition into someone who is destined for the service industry. The sound of their mockery was jagged and sharp. It was the kind of laughter that echoed with privilege and entitlement. The men at the table loosened their silk ties, leaning back in their plush dining chairs as they traded witty remarks about blue-collar workers. The women delicately dabbed the corners of their mouths with linen napkins, their eyes sparkling with the thrill of witnessing a public execution. I watched the golden light from the chandelier reflect off the polished silverware, an absurdly elegant backdrop for such a grotesque display of human cruelty. Terence reached for his wine bottle, pouring himself another generous serving. "You have to admit," Terence continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "it is a brilliant business model. No overhead, no corporate ladder to climb. Just you, a bucket of soapy water, and a sponge. I should have my sales team take notes. When a multi-million-dollar hospital deal gets too stressful, they can just quit and go vacuum a hallway." More laughter followed. The chorus of cruelty felt almost orchestrated, as if they had all rehearsed this exact moment before arriving at the house. My father William finally spoke up, though not to defend me. He simply offered a patronizing sigh. "We tried our best," William announced to his wealthy partners, spreading his hands in a gesture of helpless surrender. "We offered her the world. We paid for the best tutors, the finest private schools. But you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. Some people are just perfectly content, residing at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder." I remained an island of absolute calm in the center of their storm. I focused on the taste of the wine on my tongue, the subtle notes of cherry and oak. I focused on the steady rhythmic beating of my own heart. I refused to give them the currency of my pain. If they wanted to see a victim, they were looking at the wrong woman. The reality was almost comical. While they were busy mocking my fictional minimum wage existence, I was mentally reviewing the quarterly earnings report for Oasis Holdings. My company had just cleared $300 million in pure profit the previous month alone. My personal net worth was higher than the combined assets of every single arrogant person sitting at this table. The very chair Terence was sitting on was likely paid for by the hospital salary that my corporate board authorized. But I kept my silence. Silence is the most powerful weapon a person can wield when surrounded by fools. By remaining utterly quiet, I forced them to fill the empty space with their own toxicity. I let them expose the darkest, ugliest parts of their character for everyone to see. As the last chuckles died down, the room settled into a heavy, expectant quiet. They were waiting for my response. They were waiting for me to shatter. I offered them nothing but a serene, unbothered gaze. The lack of reaction seemed to agitate my mother even further. She hated being ignored. She hated when her carefully constructed dramatic moments did not yield the chaotic results she desired. Cynthia narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing together in a thin, furious line. She needed to push harder. She needed to break me completely, and she was about to take the next drastic step to ensure my absolute subjugation before the night was over. Cynthia slammed her perfectly manicured hand flat against the tabletop, breaking the brief silence her frustration had created. "Since you are already so well acquainted with the service industry, Gwen," she said, her voice echoing with sharp authority, "why do you not make yourself useful? The catering staff is overwhelmed in the kitchen preparing the dessert course. Get up and clear these plates. All of them." The guests froze, momentarily unsure if my mother was joking. But the rigid set of her jaw and the cold fury in her eyes made her intent perfectly clear. She was not asking for a family favor. She was issuing a command to a subordinate. She wanted to physically diminish me, to reduce me to the servant she claimed I was, right in front of her high society audience. William coughed into his fist, leaning back in his chair. "You heard your mother, Gwen. Do not just sit there taking up space. Show some gratitude for the meal." I did not argue. I did not throw my napkin down or storm out of the dining room in a tearful rage. I simply stood up. The fabric of my dress brushed silently against the mahogany chair as I moved. I maintained a posture of absolute tranquility. If they wanted a maid, I would play the role flawlessly, because stepping into the background was the perfect vantage point. People ignore the help. People talk over the help. And most importantly, people reveal their deepest secrets when they think the person clearing their plates does not matter. I walked to the head of the table, picking up my mother's china plate first. She did not even look at me, already turning her attention back to the real estate developer on her right to discuss her upcoming trip to the Amalfi Coast. I moved methodically, stacking the heavy plates and silverware with quiet efficiency. As I slid behind each guest, I became invisible, and my intelligence gathering began. Behind Allison and Terrence, I lingered just long enough to scrape a stray piece of asparagus onto a plate. Allison was whispering furiously to her husband. "You need to secure that supply line by Tuesday, Terrence. The clinic partners are getting restless. If that equipment does not arrive, they are going to audit my department." "I have it under control," Terrence hissed back, his previous bravado entirely absent when speaking privately to his wife. I maxed out the credit line to cover the initial shipment. The hospital network just needs to sign off on the vendor advance. If they delay the payment, we cannot close on the Crestview house next week. I am floating on fumes here, Allison. Do not push me. Not push. I absorbed that piece of information like a sponge. Terrence was severely overleveraged. His multi-million-dollar empire was built on a mountain of high-interest debt and a desperate reliance on a vendor advance from Pinnacle Health. An advance I had personally flagged for review 3 days ago. He was one missed payment away from total financial ruin. I moved further down the table, collecting plates from my father's business partners. A pair of finance executives were leaning close together, swirling their wine glasses. "Did you see what she parked in the driveway?" one of them muttered, nodding his head toward the front of the house. "A rented Toyota sedan." I checked the license plate when I walked in. It has a fleet sticker on the bumper. The other executive snickered, keeping his voice low. "William must be dying inside. He spends $200,000 on landscaping to impress us, and his dropout daughter parks a rental economy car right next to his Porsche. It is a disgrace. I would disown her too if she brought down my property value like that. I bet she is here to ask for a loan. People like her always come crawling back when the rent is due." I smiled inwardly as I balanced a stack of 4 plates on my forearm. The rented Toyota was doing its job perfectly. When I left my penthouse in Manhattan earlier that afternoon, my head of security had pulled the Maybach around to the front lobby. I told him to leave it in the garage. Arriving in a $500,000 armored luxury vehicle would have immediately alerted my family that the power dynamic had shifted. It would have put them on the defensive. The economy rental car was a calculated decoy. It confirmed all their biases. It made them feel superior, safe, and completely unguarded. As I reached the far end of the table, I picked up the plate of a younger hospital administrator who had arrived as a guest of Terrence. He was busy texting on his phone, completely ignoring my presence. I glanced down at his screen. He was messaging a colleague about the upcoming merger evaluations at Hawthorne Dermatology Institute. His text read, "The senior partners at Hawthorne are panicking. The new corporate overlords at Oasis Holdings are slashing bloated salaries. Allison is completely oblivious, but her department is next on the chopping block. They are going to eat her alive." I cleared his plate with a polite nod, carrying the heavy stack of porcelain toward the swinging kitchen doors. My mind was assembling the puzzle pieces with rapid precision. Allison was deeply despised by the very people she claimed to dominate. Her impending promotion was a mirage, a fragile illusion waiting to be shattered by the corporate restructuring my own board had initiated. Terrence was a fraud, drowning in debt, and entirely dependent on my signature to save his lifestyle. My parents were funding their lavish parties through William's precarious networking, surrounding themselves with fake friends who mocked them the second they turned their backs. I pushed through the kitchen doors and set the towering stack of dirty plates onto the stainless steel counter. The catering staff stared at me in shock, apologizing profusely and rushing forward to take over. I waved them off calmly. I adjusted my dress, washed my hands at the sink, and checked my reflection in the polished metal of the industrial refrigerator. I looked perfectly composed. Not a single hair was out of place. The first phase of the evening was complete. I had played the obedient servant. I had let them laugh, let them mock, let them construct their towering monument of arrogance. I had gathered every single weapon I needed to dismantle their lives piece by piece. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to step back out into the battlefield. It was time for the after-dinner drinks. It was time to let Allison and Terrence dig their own graves in the living room, and I was going to hand them the shovels. I stepped out of the kitchen, the heavy swinging doors sealing away the frantic energy of the catering staff. The hallway leading to the sunken living room was lined with my mother's curated collection of antique mirrors, each one reflecting my calm, unbothered expression. A low, smooth jazz melody drifted from the hidden sound system, mingling with the clinking of crystal decanters and the low hum of wealthy people discussing their investment portfolios. The air in the living room was thick with the scent of wood smoke from the massive stone fireplace and the heavy, expensive cologne favored by my father's business associates. I selected a quiet spot near a towering bay window that overlooked the manicured back gardens. My intention was to remain a passive observer for just a little longer, but I barely had time to smooth the fabric of my dress before the predators zeroed in. Allison and Terrence detached themselves from a group of laughing executives and made a beeline straight for me. They moved in perfect arrogant synchronization. Terrence held a snifter of aged bourbon, his posture wide and aggressively relaxed. Allison carried a delicate flute of dessert wine, her posture impossibly rigid, her chin tilted upward in that signature stance of practiced superiority. They positioned themselves purposefully, effectively trapping me between the heavy velvet curtains and a marble side table. There was no physical escape, which was exactly how they preferred to conduct their ambushes. "Gwen, sweetie," Allison cooed, her voice pitched perfectly to project warmth, while her eyes remained completely dead. "You did such a lovely job with the plates earlier. Really, you have such a knack for tidying up. I was just telling Terrence how efficient you are." I offered a slow, pleasant smile. "Thank you, Allison. Practice makes perfect." She sighed an exaggerated exhalation of breath, designed to convey deep, tragic pity. "It really breaks my heart, though. I was just thinking about it the other day. It has been exactly 10 years since you left the medical program. 10 whole years. Time flies when you are scrubbing grout, I suppose. But seriously, it must be so incredibly difficult for you tonight." I tilted my head, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Why would tonight be difficult?" Allison placed a perfectly manicured hand on her chest, feigning shock at my supposed denial. "Well, looking at me. Looking at where I am now. I am about to be named senior partner at the most elite dermatology clinic in the state. I am saving lives, or at least saving faces, which is practically the same thing in our tax bracket. And you are, well, you are doing whatever it is you do. It has to sting. Watching me achieve the dream you threw away because you simply could not handle the pressure." "I could have handled the pressure of medical school," I replied evenly. "I left because the environment was toxic and I realized I had zero passion for it. I found a different path." Terrence let out a sharp, barking laugh. He swirled the bourbon in his glass, taking a deliberate step closer to invade my personal space. "A different path," he repeated, shaking his head, as if I had just said something incredibly naive. That is the exact phrase people use when they want to put a polite spin on failure. "Look, Gwen, there is no shame in admitting you lack the killer instinct. The corporate world, the medical world, it requires a certain breed of apex predator. You have to be willing to sacrifice sleep, relationships, and basic comfort to secure the bag. Allison has the predator gene. You just lack the genetic drive." "It is true," Allison chimed in, leaning her shoulder against Terrence's arm in a display of unified superiority. "When I was doing my residency, I functioned on 3 hours of sleep and pure ambition. You always wanted comfort. You wanted easy. That is why you are still exactly where you were a decade ago. It is tragic, really. Mother cries about it sometimes when she has had too much Chardonnay. She wonders where she went wrong with your work ethic." I kept my hands loosely clasped in front of me, ensuring my body language conveyed nothing but serene acceptance. I was not angry. I was mesmerized by their absolute blindness. They were standing inches away from the woman who owned the very hospital network Terrence was currently leeching off, lecturing me about a lack of ambition. It was a spectacular display of high society delusion. I suppose everyone defines a strong work ethic differently, I said smoothly. Some people prefer to work quietly. Terrence scoffed, taking a heavy swallow of his bourbon. Quiet work is code for irrelevant work. If you are not making noise in the marketplace, you do not exist. That is business one-on-one. You need to dominate your space. I just signed a vendor contract that is going to revolutionize regional medical supplies. I did not get that by being quiet. I got that by walking into the room and making sure every executive knew I held their supply chain hostage. You have to force people to recognize your value. Allison nodded enthusiastically, her diamond earrings catching the firelight. Exactly. You have to force them to see you. But do not worry, Gwen. We do not blame you for your limitations. In fact, Terrence and I were just having a long conversation about your situation. We know how much you are struggling to make ends meet in whatever tiny apartment you are renting right now. We believe in giving back. Terrence added, his chest puffing out with self-righteous pride. A rising tide lifts all boats and all that corporate synergy nonsense. We are family after all. We cannot just sit back in our luxury penthouses while you scrape by on minimum wage. It looks bad for our brand. Allison smiled a wide, predatory grin that showed all of her perfectly whitened teeth. We actually cornered you over here because we have a very special proposition for you, Gwen. A lifeline, really. Something to help you get back on your feet and maybe finally make mother and father proud of you for once. I looked between the two of them, my expression completely neutral. Though my mind was operating at lightning speed, I knew exactly where this was going. They were setting the stage for their grand, humiliating gesture. They wanted to crush me under the weight of their fake generosity. A proposition I echoed softly. Yes, Allison said, her eyes gleaming with malicious excitement. We have some incredibly exciting news to share, and we figured out a way to include you in our success. Allison leaned in close, the scent of her overly sweet designer perfume invading my space. Terrence and I just closed on our dream home, she whispered loudly, ensuring the nearby guests could hear her triumph. $3 million. Paid mostly in cash, of course, thanks to his new hospital contract and my upcoming partnership. It is a custom build in Crestview Estates. I kept my face perfectly still, but internally a sharp jolt of pure amusement surged through me. Crestview Estates. Of all the luxury developments in the entire state of New York, they had to choose that one. Terrence puffed out his chest, adjusting his suit jacket. It is the most exclusive gated community in Westchester, he boasted, his voice carrying over the jazz music. You probably have not even heard of it, Gwen. They do not advertise to the general public. It is strictly invitation only. We are talking 7,000 square feet of prime real estate, a heated infinity pool, a wine cellar, and neighbors who run hedge funds and political action committees. It is a completely different stratosphere. The closing process was exhausting, Allison added, waving her hand dismissively. The developers are incredibly strict about who they let into the community. They run rigorous financial background checks to ensure no one brings down the prestige of the neighborhood. But naturally, our portfolio sailed right through the approval process. We move in next week. That sounds like a massive undertaking, I replied evenly, giving them exactly the setup they were fishing for. 7,000 square feet is a lot of floor space to manage. Exactly. Allison pounced on my words, her eyes lighting up with malicious glee. That is exactly what Terrence and I were discussing. A house that size requires an entire staff to maintain. We were going to hire a premier corporate cleaning service, but then I thought about you. She reached out and placed her hand over mine, her grip tight and condescending. I thought about my little sister struggling in the city, probably taking the subway to scrub floors for ungrateful strangers. And I told Terrence we have to keep our wealth in the family. We have to share our blessings. It is called philanthropy, Terrence chimed in, swirling his bourbon. I believe in giving people a hand up, not a handout. We want to offer you a steady contract, Gwen. You can be our primary housekeeper. I slowly withdrew my hand from under Allison's grip, folding my fingers together. You want to hire me to clean your new house. We want to save you. Gwen, Allison corrected, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. We are offering you a stable income. We will pay you $15 an hour. That is well above the minimum wage for unskilled labor. You can come twice a week. We will even let you raid the pantry for leftovers before you take the train back to your apartment. $15 an hour is a generous rate, Terrence emphasized, pointing his finger at me as if delivering a corporate seminar. But we expect absolute perfection. My new neighbors include CEOs and state senators. I cannot have my house looking like a disaster zone. You will need to wear a proper uniform. Nothing flashy. We will provide a list of approved eco-friendly cleaning supplies you have to use on the imported Italian marble. And obviously, you will need to work around our social schedule. We host dinner parties on Thursdays, so you will have to be completely out of the house by 4 in the afternoon. I do not want our guests feeling uncomfortable. Allison nodded, leaning closer. Think of what this could do for you, Gwen. Consistent money. You could finally buy clothes that do not look like they came from a discount rack. You might even be able to save up for community college classes. It is a second chance at life. The sheer scale of their delusion was breathtaking. They were standing in our parents' living room, dressed in their expensive clothes, offering me $15 an hour to scrub the floors of a house that my company built, managed, and financed. Crestview Estates was the crown jewel of the residential portfolio at Oasis Holdings. I had personally approved the architectural blueprints for their specific subdivision 2 years ago. I knew the exact cost of the imported Italian marble Terrence was bragging about because my procurement division had negotiated the wholesale price directly with the quarry in Milan. They did not sail through the approval process because of their impressive financial portfolio. They were approved because the automated underwriting system at Oasis Holdings processes thousands of high-risk luxury mortgages a day, and Terrence had leveraged himself to the absolute brink of bankruptcy to meet the minimum down payment. He was a house of cards dressed in a designer suit. It is a very specific kind of charity, I observed, keeping my voice mild and unthreatening. I am sure it takes a lot of generosity to offer your own sister minimum wage to clean up after your dinner parties. Do not be ungrateful! Gwen Allison snapped, her fake sweetness instantly vanishing at my lack of immediate subservience. Most people would kill for an opportunity to work in a house like ours. You get to spend your days in a luxurious environment instead of whatever dump you currently clean. You should be thanking us on your knees. We are throwing you a rope while you are drowning. It is a business arrangement, Terrence added firmly, adopting his best executive persona. Leave the emotions out of it. You provide a service, we provide capital. But let us get one thing straight right now. If we do this, you leave the family drama at the gate. When you are in our house, you are an employee. You do not talk back, you do not ask for advances on your paycheck, and you definitely do not try to socialize with our friends if they happen to see you working. We are giving you a job, not a seat at our table. I looked at Terrence, memorizing the exact arrogant tilt of his jaw and the smug satisfaction radiating from his eyes. I looked at Allison, observing the cruel, victorious smile playing on her lips. They had constructed an entire fantasy world where they reigned supreme, casting me as the tragic, helpless peasant begging for their scraps. They wanted me to bow my head, accept their humiliating offer, and confirm my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing their arrogant assumptions to settle deeply into the space. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool, solid weight of reality anchoring me to the floor. I was not angry. I was invigorated. I was standing on the precipice of their total destruction, and they were the ones eagerly handing me the detonator. I will certainly take your generous offer under consideration, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. It sounds like Crestview Estates is going to be a very illuminating experience for all of us. Terrence let out a loud, sharp snort, clearly mistaking my measured, quiet response for pathetic, desperate gratitude. He shifted his weight, puffing his chest out beneath his custom-tailored charcoal suit. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single gleaming brass key attached to a cheap plastic tag. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the glass coffee table between us. The heavy metal hit the glass with a sharp, resonant clatter that made several nearby guests pause their conversations and turn their heads in our direction. "Take it," Terrence ordered, pointing a long, manicured finger at the key. But let us establish the ground rules right now, before you get any big ideas about your new employment. That key only opens the side service door next to the garage. You do not ever use the front door. You do not walk up the main driveway where the neighbors can see you arriving. You park your little rental car down the street out of sight, and you walk up the hidden service path. Allison nodded in fervent agreement, taking a delicate sip of her dessert wine. Crestview Estates is a highly curated, ultra-exclusive community, Gwen. We have a pristine image to uphold. We simply cannot have someone in a faded t-shirt and cleaning gloves marching up our grand front steps in broad daylight. What would the neighbors think? They would think I am letting a freeloader relative drag down the neighborhood property values, Terrence answered for her, his voice dripping with absolute unfiltered disdain. And I absolutely refuse to let that happen under any circumstances. Do you understand who lives next door to us? We have a state senator on one side and a billionaire hedge fund manager on the other. I am entering the absolute upper echelon of the corporate world. My personal brand is everything. I have spent years cultivating an image of flawless, unbroken success. I am not letting your spectacular failure as an adult taint my carefully curated aesthetic. I kept my eyes fixed on the brass key resting on the glass table. The sheer audacity of his demands was almost intoxicating to witness. He was standing there outlining strict entry protocols and servant rules for a luxury house built on land my own company owned. I did not reach for the key. I simply let it sit there, an ugly little monument to his towering, fragile ego. It is crucial that you understand the massive level of success I am operating at right now. Terrence continued, interpreting my strategic silence as awestruck submission. He took a heavy swallow of his bourbon, his eyes gleaming with greedy, desperate pride. I am not just some mid-level regional manager anymore. I am the apex predator of the medical supply chain. I just locked down a multi-million-dollar exclusive vendor contract with Pinnacle Health. He paused dramatically, clearly waiting for me to gasp in shock at the name. When I offered no visible reaction, he leaned in closer, his voice rising in volume to ensure the surrounding guests could hear his triumph. Pinnacle Health, Gwen, the largest, most lucrative hospital network on the entire East Coast. They are the absolute titans of the medical industry. Every other supplier in the state was clawing at their gates, begging for scraps. But I walked into their corporate boardroom and bent their entire procurement division to my absolute will. I now control the supply lines for over 40 major hospitals. The commission I am pulling in from this single historic deal is going to pay off that $3 million house in pure cash by next year. I maintained a perfectly serene, unbothered expression, though my mind was rapidly sorting through the highly confidential financial audits sitting on my mahogany desk back in Manhattan. Terrence was lying through his teeth to anyone who would listen. Pinnacle Health had not begged him for anything. His company had submitted a desperate, aggressively priced bid that barely scraped past the initial low-level review process. Furthermore, I had personally read the risk assessment report on his company last Tuesday. The chief procurement officer had explicitly flagged Terrence's firm for predatory pricing models and a complete failure to meet basic ethical compliance standards. His so-called exclusive contract was not signed. It was currently frozen pending a final vendor compliance review. A massive network-wide review that required my personal physical signature as the chairwoman of the board for Pinnacle Health. He was banking his entire fake rich lifestyle, his new mansion, his luxury cars, and his arrogant swagger on a massive commission check that I was never ever going to authorize. "You are playing in the big leagues now, Terrence," I said smoothly, ensuring my tone conveyed polite admiration rather than the lethal impending threat it actually was. Securing a major contract with Pinnacle Health is a massive achievement. Their vendor requirements are notoriously strict. I am surprised their board of directors approved an exclusive deal of that magnitude so quickly. Terrence waved his hand dismissively, completely and utterly blinded by his own hubris. The board of directors is just a bunch of empty, out-of-touch suits pushing paper around a desk. They do not understand the real boots-on-the-ground hustle. They sign whatever the procurement guys put in front of them without reading it. I bypassed all the corporate red tape by applying direct, relentless pressure. That is how real high-level business is done. You dominate the middlemen, and the executives at the very top just blindly stamp the approvals. He leaned back, hooking his thumbs into his expensive belt loops, looking incredibly pleased with himself. So you see exactly why I cannot have you wandering around my property looking like a tragic charity case. I am hosting the regional directors from Pinnacle Health for a lavish dinner party next month at the new house to celebrate the contract. I need everything immaculate. If you want this $15 an hour job, you show up through the servant entrance, you clean the imported marble floors until they shine, and you leave long before the important people arrive. You remain entirely invisible. Do we have a deal? I looked at the brass key again. I looked at Allison, who was watching me with a sickeningly triumphant smile, utterly thrilled to see her own sister reduced to the family maid. Then I looked at Terence, a man inflating his chest with stolen air, bragging about a contract he did not actually own in a house he could not actually afford, trying to belittle the very woman who held his entire financial future in the palm of her hand. They wanted me to be invisible. They wanted me to use the service door and hide in the shadows so their fragile, hollow kingdom could remain undisturbed. They had spent the entire evening digging a spectacular, inescapable trap for themselves, and now they were practically begging me to spring it. I will definitely keep your specific entry requirements in mind, Terence, I replied, my voice calm, flat, and perfectly measured. It is always highly important to know exactly who belongs at the front door and who belongs at the back. Terence smirked, picking up the key and shoving it aggressively toward my side of the glass table. Good. Pick it up. Keep it safe. And do not make me regret giving you this massive handout. I did not touch the key. I left it exactly where it lay. The final critical pieces of my strategy were moving into perfect position. My father was currently making his way across the living room, heading straight toward us, with a group of his most prominent wealthy investors in tow. The audience was assembling for the grand finale. The pressure cooker was sealed tight, the heat was turning up, and the explosion was imminent. I stared at the cheap brass key resting on the expensive glass table, the physical manifestation of Terence and Allison's absolute crushing arrogance. My face remained a perfectly crafted mask of serene compliance, but internally my mind was operating with the cold, precise efficiency of a supercomputer processing a hostile takeover. I was cataloging every single insult, every microaggression, every performative flex they had just delivered. They had spent the last 15 minutes aggressively outlining their entire financial strategy to the exact person who held the power to detonate it. It was a spectacular, almost poetic level of ignorance. 10 years ago, when I left medical school, my parents had stripped me of everything. They cut off my tuition, canceled my credit cards, and locked me out of the family trust. They threw me out into the harsh reality of Manhattan with nothing but a single suitcase and a mountain of student debt. They expected me to fail. They desperately wanted me to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness and accepting my designated role as the subservient lesser daughter. Instead, I took a job cleaning luxury apartments on the Upper East Side. I scrubbed imported marble floors, just like Terence had so vividly described. But I didn't just clean those apartments. I studied them. I observed how the ultra-wealthy managed their properties, how the building management companies operated, and how aggressively they overcharged for mediocre services. I took every penny of my cleaning income and started my own boutique property management firm. I hired a team of dedicated, hardworking women who were tired of being exploited by large corporations. I paid them double the industry standard, and in return, they delivered absolute perfection. My client list exploded. Within 3 years, my boutique firm had acquired 3 struggling management companies. Within 5 years, I had parlayed those acquisitions into a commercial real estate portfolio. By year 7, I founded Oasis Holdings. I transitioned from managing properties to buying them outright. We started with mid-level commercial spaces, then rapidly expanded into luxury residential developments and high-yield medical infrastructure. My company didn't just participate in the market, we actively shaped it. And now at 33, I was the sole founder and CEO of a private equity empire that generated more profit in a single quarter than my father's entire network of investors would see in a lifetime. I was a ghost in the corporate world, operating almost entirely behind the scenes through a web of LLCs and holding companies. I didn't give interviews to Forbes, I didn't attend flashy charity galas, and I absolutely did not brag about my net worth at Thanksgiving dinners. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. Terrence was still smirking at me, occasionally swirling his bourbon, clearly waiting for me to break down and express my profound gratitude for his $15 an hour charity. He was so completely focused on maintaining his alpha male facade that he completely missed the lethal reality of his situation. My mind effortlessly connected the data points he had just so carelessly provided. Terrence's medical supply company had bid on an exclusive contract with Pinnacle Health. Oasis Holdings had acquired a controlling stake in Pinnacle Health 24 months prior. I was the chairwoman of the Pinnacle Health Board. I personally reviewed the vendor audits. Terrence's bid had been flagged by my chief procurement officer for severe compliance violations, specifically predatory pricing models designed to exploit hospital supply shortages. He had pushed the contract through the lower-level approvals using aggressive sales tactics and borderline intimidation, but it still required final executive authorization. My authorization. He was bragging about a multi-million-dollar deal that was currently sitting on my desk awaiting my physical signature. He had leveraged his entire lifestyle, including the down payment on a $3 million mansion, against a commission check that he believed was guaranteed. He was financially exposed, vulnerable, and completely unaware that he had just handed the trigger to his executioner. And then there was Allison, my perfect, haughty golden child sister, prattling on about her upcoming promotion to senior partner at the Hawthorne Dermatology Institute. She genuinely believed her aggressive upselling of cosmetic procedures made her a titan of the medical industry. She was entirely ignorant of the fact that Oasis Holdings' medical investment arm had aggressively pursued a buyout of Hawthorne earlier that quarter. The senior partners at her clinic were drowning in administrative debt and desperate for a corporate bailout. My acquisition team had finalized the purchase of a 60% controlling stake in Hawthorne just last week. The ink on the merger documents was barely dry. As part of the restructuring plan, my team had audited the clinic's HR department. Allison's personnel file was a disaster zone of formal complaints from nurses, technicians, and junior staff, detailing her toxic, abusive management style. As the new majority owner, I had personally instructed the clinic's management board to freeze all senior partnership promotions, pending a comprehensive disciplinary review. Allison was not ascending to the throne. She was about to be summoned to an HR tribunal. They had built a magnificent, glittering house of cards, and they were standing right in the middle of it, handing me the matches. I looked down at the brass key again, the cheap plastic tag glaringly out of place on the expensive glass table. It was supposed to be a symbol of my subservience, a heavy, tangible reminder that I was only allowed to enter their lives through the back door. It was a beautiful, cruel metaphor. I didn't need to enter through the back door. I owned the land the house was built on. I owned the hospital network that funded the mortgage. I owned the clinic that provided their secondary income. I was the landlord of their entire existence. The urge to laugh was almost overwhelming, a sharp, buzzing energy thrumming just beneath my skin. The sheer, unadulterated irony of the situation was exquisite. They had spent the entire evening performing a desperate pantomime of wealth, utilizing every cruel elitist trick they knew to assert their dominance. They had treated me like dirt to make themselves feel like diamonds. I allowed the silence to stretch for another few seconds, letting them savor their perceived victory. I wanted this moment committed to their memories forever. I wanted them to remember exactly how smug, how confident, and how invincible they felt right now. Because when the illusion shattered, I wanted the contrast to be absolute. I wanted the devastating realization of their own insignificance to hit them with the force of a physical blow. I was done playing the maid. I had gathered all the necessary intelligence. The board was set, the pieces were in place, and it was time to execute the strategy. I mentally prepared the sequence of events. I would start with the real estate dismantle, the hospital contract, and finish with the clinic promotion. I would tear down their carefully curated facade brick by brick right in front of the very audience they had assembled to witness my humiliation. The Thanksgiving dinner was about to feature a spectacular serving of corporate retribution. The heavy crystal of a whiskey tumbler clinking against a gold wedding band announced my father's arrival before he even spoke. William strode across the plush Persian rug, projecting the manufactured confidence of a man who believed he owned the world simply because he leased a small corner of it. Trailing closely behind him were three of his most prominent investors, men with silver hair, custom Italian suits, and the same predatory glint in their eyes that my father worked so tirelessly to emulate. William halted at the edge of our tense little triangle. His gaze flicked from Allison's triumphant smirk to Terrence's puffed-out chest, and finally down to the cheap brass key resting on the glass coffee table. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not pull me aside to check if my sister and brother-in-law were harassing me. In my father's world, vulnerability was a liability, and any tension was merely an opportunity to assert dominance. "What exactly are we discussing over here?" William asked, his voice booming with artificial joviality. He angled his body slightly, so his investors had a clear view of the interaction. "You three look like you are closing a major merger." Terrence seized the spotlight immediately. "We were just offering Gwen a bit of a stimulus package, William. Allison and I know how much she struggles to keep her head above water in the city. We decided to hire her as the primary housekeeper for our new property in Crestview Estates, $15 an hour. We even gave her the service entrance key." William's eyes lit up. This was not a family conflict to him. This was a public relations goldmine. Here was a chance to demonstrate to his wealthy backers that his family was not only wildly successful, but also incredibly magnanimous. He could play the role of the benevolent patriarch who guided his highly accomplished children to care for the weaker, lesser members of the flock. "Is that so?" William said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He turned to his investors, a proud, broad smile stretching across his face. "You see, gentlemen, this is exactly what I mean when I talk about the culture of this family. We take care of our own. Allison and Terrence just purchased a phenomenal $3 million estate, and their first instinct is to create employment for someone who desperately needs it. That is the kind of moral backbone you want in your business partners." The investors nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their approval. One of them, the aging real estate developer, chuckled and pointed his cigar at Terrence. "It is brilliant. You keep the wealth internal, and you ensure the job gets done by someone who answers directly to you. It is a very disciplined approach to household management." I sat perfectly still, listening to these men discuss my poverty as if I were a stray dog they were considering adopting for tax benefits. The sheer scale of their condescension was suffocating, filling the room like thick smoke. But I did not cough. I did not flinch. William turned his attention back to me. The jovial warmth vanished from his face, replaced by a stern, authoritative glare. He was stepping into the role of the strict, unforgiving CEO, managing a subordinate who was failing to meet expectations. "Well," Gwen William demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the vast living room, "are you going to just sit there staring at the table, or are you going to show some gratitude? Your sister and brother-in-law are throwing you a massive lifeline. They are offering you a stable income in a safe, elite environment. They are saving you from whatever dead-end existence you are currently scraping together." I looked up at him, my expression unreadable. "I am carefully considering the terms of their offer," I replied evenly. "Considering it?" William scoffed, his face flushing with sudden intense irritation. His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of the remaining guests who had not yet tuned into the spectacle. "There is nothing to consider. You dropped out of a prestigious medical program. You embarrassed this family. You chose a life of manual labor over intellectual pursuit. You do not have the luxury of considering an offer like this. You take it, and you say thank you." The room grew impossibly quiet. The soft jazz music playing from the hidden speakers seemed to fade into the background. All 18 guests had completely stopped their conversations. They were turning in their seats, gripping their wine glasses, watching the public execution unfold. The social pressure was absolute. In their eyes, I was a cornered animal entirely trapped by my own failures and my family's overwhelming generosity. William stepped closer, pointing a rigid finger at the brass key on the table. "Pick up the key, Gwen." I did not move. "I said pick up the key." William repeated, his tone dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "You will not humiliate me in front of my partners by acting like a spoiled, ungrateful child. Allison and Terrence are giving you a golden opportunity. You will pick up that key, you will look them in the eye, and you will thank them properly for keeping you off the streets." Cynthia materialized from the crowd, her silk dress rustling as she glided to my father's side. She placed a restraining hand on his arm, playing the role of the peacekeeper while actively twisting the knife. "William, calm down," Cynthia cooed softly, though her voice was perfectly pitched for everyone to hear. "Do not be too hard on her. You know Gwen struggles to process complex situations. It probably overwhelms her to be in the presence of so much success." She looked down at me, her eyes glittering with pure, unfiltered malice. "Go on, sweetheart. Do as your father says. Pick up the key. It is the best thing that has happened to you in 10 years. You should be crying tears of joy." The trap was fully sprung. They had formed an impenetrable wall of wealthy, arrogant authority. Terrence stood with his arms crossed, a victor anticipating his spoils. Allison tilted her chin up, waiting for my verbal submission. My father glared down at me, a tyrant demanding total obedience. My mother smiled her venomous smile, reveling in my absolute destruction. The audience of 18 high society guests watched with bated breath, eager to see the disgraced daughter finally bow her head and accept her place at the bottom of the food chain. The air in the living room was so thick with tension, it felt practically combustible. They had pushed me exactly as far as I needed them to go. They had completely stripped away any remaining shred of family loyalty or polite restraint. I had given them every opportunity to show a single ounce of grace, and they had chosen total public annihilation instead. I uncrossed my legs. I placed my delicate porcelain teacup onto its matching saucer with a soft, definitive clink. I did not reach for the key. Instead, I leaned back against the plush fabric of my chair, resting my hands in my lap, and looked directly into my father's furious eyes. The time for observation was officially over. My absolute stillness seemed to break something fundamental inside my mother. Cynthia was a woman who thrived on total submission. She required her targets to physically crumble, to weep, to lower their eyes and beg for her magnanimous forgiveness. My calm, unblinking silence was an act of extreme defiance that she simply could not process. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened into fists at her sides, the heavy diamond rings catching the light from the chandelier as her knuckles turned stark white. "Are you deaf?" Cynthia shrieked, her voice suddenly losing all of its cultivated country club polish. The sharp grating sound completely shattered the remaining ambient jazz music playing in the living room. She took a highly aggressive step forward, breaching the unspoken physical boundary of polite society. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged fury. "Your sister is about to become a senior partner at the most elite medical facility in this state. She treats patients whose net worth you cannot even begin to comprehend. She is practically American royalty, and she is standing here lowering herself to offer you a literal lifeline out of your pathetic, squalid little life." The social suffocation in the room became incredibly palpable. The 18 guests who had previously been enjoying the show with detached amusement now shifted uncomfortably in their plush, leather, and velvet seats. The atmosphere had transitioned from a cruel, sophisticated parlor game into a raw, ugly display of domestic abuse. Yet nobody intervened. Nobody stepped forward to defuse the situation. They remained frozen, a silent audience of enablers, their collective silence endorsing the psychological violence raining down on me. I could feel their eyes burning into my skin, tracking every single micro-expression on my face. The sheer weight of their collective judgment was designed to crush my windpipe, to make me choke on my own humiliation. Cynthia continued her relentless verbal assault, pacing the narrow space between the glass coffee table and the velvet sofa. "Allison is giving you a gift from God, Gwen. A senior partner is taking pity on you." Do you have any idea how many people would kill for this level of access? You live in filth. You surround yourself with dirt and grime. You are nothing but a dropout who squandered every single advantage we ever handed you on a silver platter. And now, when your brilliant, successful, highly educated sister bends down to pull you out of the gutter, you sit there staring at us like an arrogant, insolent child. My mother was practically vibrating with rage. The veins in her neck stood out in sharp relief against her expensive pearl necklace. She was laying all her cards on the table, weaponizing Allison's impending promotion as the ultimate bludgeon to beat me into absolute submission. She wanted the entire room to view Allison as a benevolent deity and me as an ungrateful wretch who deserved to be starved into compliance. "Look at her," William echoed, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with his wife. He crossed his arms over his chest, forming a rigid barricade that physically blocked my exit. She is too proud to admit she is drowning. She would rather sink to the bottom of the ocean than admit her sister is vastly superior to her in every conceivable metric. Terrence leaned in from my left, completely closing off my peripheral vision. He boxed me in against the heavy window drapes, his tall frame looming over my seated position. The smell of his strong bourbon and overbearing cologne was nauseating. "You are out of options," Gwen Terrence sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing, theatrical whisper. "The real world does not care about your stubborn pride. You either pick up that key and accept your place, or you walk out that front door and never ever come back. We are done funding your delusions. We are done pretending you are an equal member of this family." The physical cornering was entirely deliberate and incredibly claustrophobic. They had formed a tight, suffocating semicircle around my chair. Cynthia at the front, William to her right, Terrence looming on my left, and Allison standing slightly behind them, wearing a smug, victorious sneer. They had effectively walled me off from the rest of the room. The 18 guests were watching a pack of wolves corner a solitary, defenseless deer. The air conditioning in the massive suburban estate seemed to fail completely. The room felt incredibly hot, incredibly small, and incredibly dangerous. Cynthia leaned over the glass table, bringing her face mere inches from mine. Her eyes were wide, manic, and completely devoid of any maternal affection. "I want to hear you say it," Cynthia demanded, her voice dropping into a venomous, hissing command. "I want to hear you say thank you to Allison. I want to hear you admit that you failed, that you need her charity, and that you will gladly take this job to scrub her floors. Say it right now, Gwen. Say it, or I swear to you I will make sure you never step foot in this house again." The silence that followed her ultimatum was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a massive structural collapse. Every single person in that lavishly decorated living room was holding their breath. The wealthy real estate developers, the hospital administrators, the silent, complicit relatives. They were all waiting for my spirit to finally snap in half. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the arrogant, stubborn dropout finally bend the knee and beg for the scraps her glorious family was tossing onto the floor. The pressure cooker had reached its maximum threshold. The heat was blinding, the hostility was deafening, and the psychological warfare had peaked. They had successfully backed me into the tightest, darkest corner they could possibly construct. The collective weight of their arrogance pressed down on my shoulders, a heavy, suffocating blanket of social dominance designed to bury me alive. The 18 guests leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide and unblinking, anticipating my complete and total surrender. The absolute destruction of my dignity was the grand finale of their Thanksgiving entertainment, and my mother was eagerly demanding her standing ovation. The room was entirely motionless. 18 pairs of eyes locked onto my frame, waiting for the inevitable collapse. They expected tears. They expected a trembling voice apologizing for my mere existence. They expected me to snatch that cheap brass key off the glass table and scurry out of the room branded as the ultimate family failure. Cynthia leaned so close, I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, her breath carrying the sharp scent of expensive Chardonnay and bitter desperation. Terrence shifted his weight, his leather shoes creaking against the hardwood floor. William crossed his arms tighter, attempting to form an impenetrable fortress of patriarchal authority. Allison simply smiled her venomous, victorious smile, eagerly anticipating the exact moment my spirit snapped. Instead of shrinking away, I slowly reached forward. My hand did not shake, my fingers did not tremble. I refused to operate on their frantic frequency. I picked up the delicate porcelain teacup resting on the edge of the table. I brought the rim to my lips and took a slow, methodical sip of the herbal blend. The hot liquid slid down my throat, a warm and grounding contrast to the freezing hostility surrounding me. Every single person in the room watched the movement with bizarre, stunned fascination. It was a complete deviation from the script they had painstakingly written for me. Victims do not leisurely sip tea when they are backed into a corner. Victims do not maintain perfect upright posture when they are being verbally slaughtered in front of an elite audience. I lowered the cup. I placed it back onto its matching saucer with deliberate, ice-cold precision. The sharp ceramic clink echoed through the cavernous living room like a gunshot. It was a crisp, definitive sound that cut straight through the suffocating tension. The frantic, aggressive energy that Cynthia, William, Terrence, and Allison had whipped up suddenly hit a solid, impenetrable wall. The chaotic pacing of the room abruptly slowed down, grinding to an absolute halt. The frenzy evaporated, replaced by a dense, confusing stillness. My sheer lack of emotional response was actively disrupting their carefully manufactured power dynamic. I looked at my mother. The manic gleam in her eyes flickered just for a fraction of a second, replaced by a tiny microscopic spark of uncertainty. She hated the silence. She demanded an explosive reaction, and I was deliberately starving her of it. Her chest heaved as she drew breath to launch another verbal assault, but my unwavering gaze paralyzed her vocal cords. I shifted my attention to William. The veins in his neck pulsed, his face flushed red from maintaining his aggressive stance. Yet his brow furrowed as his business-oriented mind failed to comprehend my absolute tranquility. In the corporate world, he worshipped silence from an opponent either meant total defeat or lethal confidence. My posture radiated the latter. I turned my eyes to Terrence. The imposing, towering stance he had assumed started to look significantly less like an apex predator and significantly more like a cheap, inflatable prop. His heavy cologne could not mask the anxious shift in his breathing. He had expected me to cower from his physical dominance. Instead, I observed him with detached curiosity. And finally, I looked at Allison. Her victorious smile twitched at the corners, the muscles in her face straining to hold the condescending expression as my silence stretched out into eternity. The golden child was realizing in real time that her ultimate triumph was falling completely flat. The guests seated around the perimeter of the room began to stir. The business partners and relatives shifted uncomfortably. The entertainment value of the public execution was rapidly souring. They had tuned in to watch a slaughter, but instead they were witnessing a strange psychological standoff. The wealthy real estate developer who had laughed so loudly at the dinner table now set his crystal tumbler down, his brow deeply furrowed. The young hospital administrator swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward the front door. They could all sense the atmospheric pressure dropping. The room felt incredibly heavy. I did not break eye contact with my family. I let the silence stretch for another agonizing 10 seconds. I was giving them the rope, and they had greedily stepped onto the gallows. All they needed now was for someone to pull the lever. My mind was entirely clear, stripped of any lingering childhood trauma or desire for parental affection. The woman sitting in this chair was not the depressed, exhausted 23-year-old dropout they remembered. She was the sole architect of Oasis Holdings. I mapped out the precise execution strategy in my head. I would not yell. I would not raise my voice a single decibel. True authority does not need to scream to be heard. I would simply dismantle their entire reality, using the very assets they had just bragged about. I would take Terrence over leveraged debt, Allison fraudulent promotion, and my parents' desperate need for social validation, and I would crush them all simultaneously. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored dress, brushing away an invisible speck of dust. The casual, dismissive gesture drew every eye. I uncrossed my ankles and planted both feet firmly on the expensive Persian rug. The semicircle of hostility that my mother, father, sister, and brother-in-law had formed around me suddenly felt remarkably fragile. They thought they had boxed me in. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one who had locked the doors, sealed the exits, and trapped them inside with me. The stage was flawlessly set. The audience was entirely captivated. They had exhausted all their ammunition on a bulletproof target. I let out a slow, quiet breath, feeling the immense, crushing weight of my hidden empire standing solidly behind me. It was time to pull back the curtain. It was time to show the Westchester elite exactly what a real apex predator looked like. Let the games begin. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the armrests of the velvet chair. When I finally spoke, my voice was devoid of the tremor they had so eagerly anticipated. It was low, resonant, and entirely stripped of familial warmth. I needed to ensure that every single syllable was logged into the collective memory of the 18 witnesses surrounding us. I wanted no ambiguity, no room for them to backtrack when the ground finally opened up beneath their feet. Let me make sure I understand the absolute magnitude of what we are discussing here. I began my tone deceptively conversational. I shifted my gaze directly to my older sister. Allison, you mentioned earlier that you are officially ascending to senior partner at the Hawthorne Dermatology Institute. Is that correct? The promotion is finalized. Allison practically vibrated with vindicated joy. She interpreted my calm inquiry as the initial stage of my surrender. She assumed I was finally bowing to her insurmountable superiority, asking for confirmation so I could properly grovel. She tossed her highlighted hair over her shoulder and offered a laugh that sounded like shattering glass. It is practically written in stone, Gwen Allison boasted, ensuring her voice carried over to the business partners lingering nearby. The current managing partners are finalizing the equity distribution this week. My client retention rate is the highest in the clinic's history. They cannot afford to lose me, and they know it. I am the face of their future profitability. Fascinating, I replied smoothly, filing her arrogant confirmation away in my mental ledger. And you are absolutely certain there are no administrative hurdles, no sudden corporate restructuring that might delay your coronation. Allison scoffed, her eyes rolling in exaggerated exasperation. Corporate restructuring. At Hawthorne, please. We operate as an independent elite private practice. We answer to no one but ourselves and our high net worth clientele. The only hurdle is deciding which corner office I want to claim for my new private suite. I nodded slowly, letting her absolute certainty hang in the humid air of the living room. She was so hopelessly blind to the shifting tectonic plates of the medical industry. I turned my attention to my brother-in-law. He was leaning against the heavy window drapes, still clutching his bourbon, looking incredibly pleased that his wife was dominating the conversation. And Terrence, I said, projecting my voice just enough to ensure the hospital administrator standing by the fireplace could hear every word. You just closed on a $3 million property in Crestview Estates. A custom build, you said. And this massive purchase is entirely funded by your new exclusive vendor contract with Pinnacle Health. Terrence beamed. He saw my question as an invitation to take a victory lap in front of my father's wealthy investors. That is exactly right, he proclaimed, taking a triumphant sip of his drink. Signed, sealed, and practically delivered. We take the keys to the Crestview property next week. It is a monumental financial commitment, but when you control the primary supply chain for the largest hospital network on the East Coast, a $3 million mortgage is basically pocket change. I tilted my head, keeping my expression entirely neutral. An exclusive contract of that magnitude usually requires extensive executive review. You are entirely confident that Pinnacle Health's board of directors has finalized the vendor compliance authorizations. There are no outstanding audits regarding your pricing models. Terrence let out a loud, patronizing groan. He looked at my father and shook his head, acting as if he were dealing with a particularly slow child. Gwen, you really need to stay in your lane. You are asking questions about a corporate ecosystem you do not even remotely understand. When I negotiate a deal, I bypass the lower-level compliance drones. The procurement director gave me his absolute verbal guarantee. The board of directors is just a rubber stamp. They will authorize the contract because they desperately need my inventory. I hold all the leverage. So the contract relies entirely on the board's final authorization, I clarified, my voice dropping an octave, tightening the linguistic noose. And you have already leveraged that anticipated income to secure the mortgage on the Crestview property. It is called aggressive financial maneuvering, Terrence sneered, stepping away from the drapes to loom over the glass coffee table again. You leverage future guaranteed capital to secure immediate premium assets. It is how wealth is generated. But I would not expect a cleaning woman to understand high-level collateralization. You just focus on the bleach and the sponges, and let me handle the multi-million-dollar infrastructure. I did not flinch. I turned my gaze back to my parents. Cynthia and William were standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces flushed with intoxicating pride. They were practically glowing with the satisfaction of watching their golden children put the family failure in her place. "Mother, Father," I said, addressing them with a chilling formality. "You both endorse this. You stand behind Terrence's aggressive financial maneuvering and Allison's absolute certainty regarding her clinic's independence. You believe these are the hallmarks of our family's superior legacy." William puffed out his chest, stepping forward to claim his share of the glory. "Absolutely," my father declared, his voice booming for the benefit of the silent audience. "They represent the pinnacle of capitalist ambition. They take enormous risks, they dominate their respective fields, and they reap the massive rewards. They are the exact blueprint of success that I built this family upon." Cynthia smiled, a wide, predatory expression that showed all of her teeth. "They are winners, Gwen," my mother hissed, leaning over the table again. "They do not ask for permission. They take what belongs to them. And right now, they are offering to take you under their wing. I suggest you stop asking utterly irrelevant questions about corporate compliance and start thanking them for their immense generosity." The trap was now fully armed and locked. Every single one of them had proudly, loudly, and arrogantly confirmed their precarious positions on the public record. They had tethered their entire identities, their financial security, and their social standing to institutions they wrongly believed they controlled. They were standing on a frozen lake, boasting about the thickness of the ice, completely unaware that I was the one holding the explosive charges beneath the surface. I looked at the 18 guests watching us. I wanted them to remember this specific moment. I wanted them to remember the absolute, unyielding smugness radiating from my family before the reality of their situation came crashing down around them. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the adrenaline flood my veins. The interrogation was over. It was time to deliver the verdict. I let the silence hang for exactly 3 more seconds. Then, for the first time all evening, I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the submissive, apologetic grimace my mother had spent her entire life trying to beat into me. It was a cold, razor-sharp curve of the lips devoid of any familial affection. It was the smile of an executioner who had just been handed the signed warrant. The effect it had on my family was instantaneous. My mother actually took a half-step backward, her maternal predator instincts suddenly registering a massive, unforeseen threat. William narrowed his eyes, his corporate radar finally pinging with the realization that the dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. I unclasped my hands and gestured casually toward the cheap brass key still sitting abandoned on the glass coffee table. I looked directly into Terrence's aggressively puffed-out chest, bypassing his eyes entirely, to speak to the fragile ego hiding underneath his expensive charcoal suit. "I am glad you like Crestview Estates, Terrence," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air with absolute unyielding clarity. "It is one of my firm's favorite developments, but you just missed your first mortgage payment to my company." The entire room froze. It was not a figurative stillness. It was a literal physical paralysis that gripped all 18 people in the living room simultaneously. The air was violently sucked out of the space, leaving behind a vacuum of sheer, unadulterated shock. A wealthy hospital administrator standing near the fireplace stopped midway through, bringing a crystal glass to his mouth, the rim hovering frozen an inch from his lips. The aging real estate developer ceased his arrogant chuckling, his cigar hanging loosely between his fingers as a long ash threatened to fall onto the Persian rug. The soft jazz music playing from the hidden speakers suddenly sounded deafeningly loud in the total absence of human noise. I watched the exact words I had spoken collide with my family's deeply entrenched delusions. It was like watching a luxury cruise liner strike a massive submerged iceberg. The impact was silent at first, but the structural damage was catastrophic and immediate. Terence blinked, his face twitching as his brain desperately tried to translate a sentence that mathematically destroyed his entire reality. His jaw went completely slack. The arrogant sneer that had been permanently plastered across his face melted away, replaced by a vacant, hollow look of total incomprehension. Allison whipped her head around to stare at her husband, her perfect posture crumbling as confusion overrode her manufactured haughtiness. She looked from Terence back to me, her eyes wide, searching for the punchline of a joke she did not understand. Cynthia let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hand flying up to clutch her expensive pearl necklace. William simply stared, his mouth slightly open, the quintessential image of a patriarch realizing his kingdom was built on quicksand. Terence was the first to attempt a recovery. His survival instincts kicked in, wrapped entirely in denial. He let out a loud, harsh bark of laughter that sounded incredibly forced and entirely devoid of humor. "What kind of pathetic, desperate joke is this?" Terence scoffed, pointing a shaking finger at me. He looked around the room, desperately seeking validation from the frozen audience. "Are you actually hallucinating right now? Did inhaling all those chemical cleaners finally melt your brain? You are a maid, Gwen. You scrub toilets for a living. You do not own a real estate development company. Do not engage with her, Terence." Cynthia hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sudden, inexplicable terror. "She is having a psychotic break. She is deliberately trying to ruin our Thanksgiving with her pathetic delusions. William, call security and have her removed from the property immediately." I did not break eye contact with Terence. I did not acknowledge my mother's frantic, desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative. I simply reached into the sleek designer clutch resting beside me on the velvet chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, and commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "I am not hallucinating, Terence," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre that resonated in the quiet room. "And I do not make jokes regarding my financial portfolios. You applied for a high-risk luxury mortgage 3 weeks ago. Your debt-to-income ratio was abysmal. Every traditional bank in the state of New York rejected your application because they saw exactly what you are, a liability dressed in a custom suit." I watched the color completely drain from his face. The deep, rich brown of his complexion faded to a sickly ashen gray. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He knew I was telling the truth. I was reciting confidential financial data that no simple house cleaner could possibly possess. "The only reason you secured that financing," I continued relentlessly, "is because the automated underwriting system at Oasis Holdings processes high-yield, predatory luxury mortgages for individuals exactly like you. Individuals who leverage imaginary future commissions to buy houses they cannot afford, simply to impress neighbors who do not care about them. You signed the final paperwork on the 14th of this month, and your first good faith payment due 48 hours ago was returned for insufficient funds." Terence stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the heavy window drapes. The bourbon sloshed violently in his glass, spilling over the rim and staining his expensive suit jacket. He did not even notice the spill. He was staring at me as if I had just morphed into a mythological monster right in front of his eyes. "You are lying!" Allison shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. She grabbed her husband's arm, shaking him. "Tell her she is lying, Terence. Tell everyone she is just a jealous, delusional failure." But Terence could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The 18 guests watched the mighty apex predator of the medical supply chain reduced to a trembling, silent wreck by a woman he had just offered $15 an hour. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had completely inverted, trapping them all underneath its crushing weight. My father's wealthy business partners, men who had spent the last hour praising Terence's ruthless business acumen, now stared at him with naked disgust. In their elite circle, aggressive capitalism was applauded, but financial insolvency was an unforgivable sin. Terrence was exposed not as a titan, but as a fraud. William noticed the shifting judgment of his peers. His face twisted into a mask of absolute horror. The carefully curated image of his flawless dominant family was bleeding out onto the expensive Persian rug. He took a threatening step toward me, raising his hand as if he could physically force the words back into my mouth. "Enough of this absolute nonsense!" William bellowed, his voice echoing violently off the antique mirrors. "I will not stand here and listen to a dropout slander my son-in-law with fabricated financial jargon. You read a few articles online and think you can walk into my home and play corporate raider." I simply smiled wider, exposing the absolute hollowness of his authority. The execution had barely begun. I pulled my phone from my designer clutch, tapping the screen with a calm and practiced rhythm. My father's booming voice faded into the background as I accessed the secured executive portal of my company network. I did not look up immediately. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to wait entirely on my terms. When I finally raised my eyes, I directed my attention back to my brother-in-law, who was still practically hyperventilating against the heavy window drapes. Lot 42, Crestview Estates, Phase 3. I recited, my voice echoing clearly across the silent living room. 7,200 square feet. Custom Italian marble in the grand foyer, exactly as you boasted earlier, Terrence. A heated infinity pool facing the eastern ridge. You secured the property under a shell LLC, presumably to hide your staggering personal debt ratio from your new country club friends. The total purchase price was $3.1 million. You put down a meager 5%, an absolute violation of standard luxury underwriting, which I personally overrode purely to allow you to hang yourself with your own financial rope. Your monthly mortgage payment, inclusive of the exorbitant homeowner association fees that you explicitly agreed to, is $24,650. A payment that bounced yesterday at exactly 9 in the morning. Terrence let out a strangled, breathless sound. He looked as though the floor had literally dropped out from beneath him. His eyes darted wildly toward his wife, begging for a lifeline that Allison was entirely incapable of providing. "How do you know that?" Allison whispered, her voice trembling so violently that the dessert wine in her glass threatened to spill. "How could you possibly know our exact lot number and payment history? You are a maid. You clean houses. You do not have access to sealed real estate deeds." "I am not a maid, Allison," I replied, my tone devoid of any sibling warmth, "though I certainly allowed you all to believe that for the last decade. It was the perfect cover. 10 years ago, when mother and father cut me off, I did not cry. I did not beg. I took the only job I could find without a completed degree. I scrubbed the floors of luxury penthouses on the Upper East Side. I cleaned the toilets of investment bankers, hedge fund managers, and real estate developers. But while I was polishing their imported countertops, I was also listening. I was studying how they managed their wealth, how their property management companies routinely overcharged them for abysmal services, and how deeply inefficient the luxury real estate market truly was. I stood up slowly, ensuring every single person in the room tracked my movement. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, commanding the physical space of the living room with an absolute terrifying calm. I did not stay on my knees scrubbing floors. I continued pacing slowly toward the glass coffee table where the cheap brass key still lay. Within 6 months, I hired 5 other marginalized women. Within a year, I had a fleet of 50. I built a boutique cleaning service that catered exclusively to the absolute highest echelon of Manhattan society. I leveraged those intimate connections to transition into property management. I bought out my competitors one by one. I took the bloated, mismanaged portfolios of lazy landlords and turned them into streamlined, highly profitable assets. By the time I turned 28, my management firm was generating enough liquid capital that I no longer needed to manage properties. I decided to buy them outright. William stared at me, his face a mask of conflicting, horrified emotions. The arrogant patriarch was desperately trying to reconcile the daughter he had discarded with the corporate titan standing in his living room. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. I was not finished dismantling their reality. I consolidated my assets and founded Oasis Holdings. I announced, ensuring the name landed heavily on the ears of the wealthy business partners scattered around the room. I saw several of the older investors physically jolt at the name. They recognized it immediately. Oasis Holdings was a ghost in the financial sector, a massive private equity firm known for aggressive acquisitions and absolute market dominance. We moved aggressively into commercial real estate, then high-yield residential developments, I explained, looking directly at Cynthia, who was gripping the back of a velvet armchair for physical support. 5 years ago, Oasis Holdings purchased 3,000 acres of undeveloped land in Westchester. We brought in elite architects, secured the zoning permits, and completely redefined the luxury housing market in this region. We built a gated community designed to attract the exact kind of status, obsessed financially irresponsible buyers who would overpay for the illusion of exclusivity. I picked up the brass key from the table and held it up to the light, letting the cheap metal glint in the chandelier illumination. We built Crestview Estates, I stated, dropping the final devastating piece of the puzzle into place. I am not just your mortgage lender, Terrence. I am the developer. I own the management company that oversees the homeowner association. I own the private security firm that guards the front gate you just commanded me to avoid. The imported Italian marble you bragged about walking on was sourced directly by my procurement division. The very ground your new house sits on belongs to my corporate portfolio. I literally own the entire neighborhood you thought you were using to prove your superiority over me. The silence that followed was absolute destruction. There was no recovery from this. There was no witty retort, no arrogant dismissal that could save them. Terrence sank slowly onto the edge of the sofa, his head dropping into his hands as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed over him. He was completely at my mercy. If I chose to foreclose on the property, which was my legal right, given his bounced payment, he would lose everything. His credit would be annihilated. His carefully curated image would be permanently shattered. Allison stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. Her golden child complex was completely short-circuiting. She had spent her entire adult life defining herself by my perceived failures. Now she was standing face to face with a billionaire CEO, realizing that her highly praised medical salary was nothing but a rounding error in my company's daily operating budget. She was not the successful sister. She was a tenant living in my world, bound by my rules. And yet the real estate empire was only the first phase of my execution strategy. I had promised myself I would tear down every single pillar of their arrogance. Crestview Estates was just the appetizer. Terrence still had that massive multi-million-dollar medical supply contract he was so incredibly proud of, and I was about to show him exactly what a real apex predator does to a bloated, arrogant middleman. Terrence's breathing was ragged, his chest heaving violently beneath his custom-tailored jacket. He was a man desperately searching for a life raft in an ocean he had just realized was entirely owned and operated by his enemy. He shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion, and dragged a trembling hand down his face. The sheen of nervous sweat was now visibly gathering on his forehead, catching the golden light from the chandelier above. "The house is just bricks and mortar," Terrence stammered, his voice utterly stripped of its previous booming, arrogant authority. He was trying to salvage the remnants of his shattered pride in front of my father's elite investors, clinging to the only piece of leverage he thought he still possessed. "You might hold the paper on the property, Gwen, but that does not mean you own me. You think a bounced mortgage payment destroys a man like me? I am the director of sales. I just closed Pinnacle Health. That commission check clears next week, and when it does, I will buy that property out from under your little holding company in pure cash. I do not need your predatory loans." He was doubling down. It was a spectacular display of cognitive dissonance. He was clinging to his hospital contract with the desperate grip of a man falling from a skyscraper, utterly convinced he could learn to fly before he hit the pavement. I did not laugh. I simply reached back into my designer clutch. My fingers bypassed the phone I had used to expose his real estate disaster and closed around a small, remarkably heavy object. I pulled it out, keeping my hand steady and purposeful. "You have a very romanticized view of corporate procurement, Terrence," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly conversational. You speak about Pinnacle Health as if it were a conquered territory, a passive entity that simply surrendered its supply chain to your superior negotiating tactics. You told this table earlier that you bypassed all the red tape. You bragged about forcing their procurement division to bend to your will. You called their executives a bunch of empty, out-of-touch suits. I held the object between my index and middle finger. It was a solid matte black metal business card. It was heavier than standard cardstock, designed to carry a physical weight that matched its corporate significance. But what you fail to understand about the medical supply industry, I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the glass coffee table, is that high-level hospital acquisitions do not operate in a vacuum. When a network as massive as Pinnacle Health undergoes a corporate buyout, every single external vendor contract is automatically subjected to a forensic financial audit. I dropped the solid metal card onto the glass table. It landed with a sharp, heavy thud right next to the cheap brass key he had thrown at me earlier. The sound made Terrence physically flinch. "Read it," I commanded. Terrence hesitated, his eyes darting frantically from my unbothered face to the black card resting on the glass. The air in the room was so tense it felt brittle. Slowly, with a shaking hand, he reached out and picked up the metal rectangle. I watched his eyes scan the engraved silver lettering. I knew exactly what he was reading. My full name followed by my title, Chairwoman of the Board of Directors, Pinnacle Health. Underneath that, the parent company logo, Oasis Holdings. The physical reaction was catastrophic. Terrence dropped the card back onto the table as if the metal had severely burned his fingers. His knees gave out, and he collapsed heavily onto the velvet sofa, all the air rushing out of his lungs in a single defeated wheeze. The bourbon glass slipped from his loose grip, tipping over on the table, sending amber liquid spilling across the glass surface and dripping onto the expensive Persian rug below. He did not even attempt to stop it. "You," Terrence gasped, his voice barely a wet whisper. "You are the chairwoman." "I am," I confirmed coldly, standing tall over his crumpled form. "Oasis Holdings acquired Pinnacle Health 2 years ago. We injected billions in capital to modernize their failing infrastructure, which means I personally oversee the executive board that governs their operating budget. I do not just scrub floors, Terrence. I govern the entire financial ecosystem your company is attempting to leech off of." A sharp intake of breath came from the right side of the room. The young hospital administrator, the guest Terrence had invited to show off his industry connections, had just realized the sheer gravity of the situation. The administrator was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, suddenly understanding that he was standing in the living room of his ultimate superior, the billionaire chairwoman who controlled his entire career trajectory. He took 2 deliberate steps away from Terrence, physically severing any perceived association with the doomed salesman. "Your bid was a masterclass in predatory opportunism," I explained to the captive audience, ensuring my father's business partners heard every gritty detail of Terrence's fraudulent strategy. "You intentionally targeted regional supply bottlenecks. You submitted a contract that inflated the cost of critical surgical equipment by 35%, hiding the price gouging behind convoluted delivery timetables and punitive cancellation clauses. You thought you could exploit the hospital's desperate need for reliable inventory to line your own pockets." Terrence shook his head, his hands gripping his knees tight enough to turn his knuckles white. "The procurement director signed off on it," he pleaded, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "He gave me the verbal authorization. We had an agreement." "The procurement director is an idiot who values a free round of golf over ethical compliance," I replied sharply. "Which is exactly why he was terminated yesterday afternoon." Terrence's head snapped up, pure horror written across his face. "Yes, Terrence," I said, delivering the lethal blow. "Your internal champion at Pinnacle Health has been fired for gross negligence, and your highly celebrated multi-million-dollar exclusive contract never made it past my desk. I flagged your bid for severe compliance violations 3 days ago. I initiated a total freeze on your company's vendor status." I took a step closer, forcing him to look up at me. "On Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I am personally launching a forensic vendor compliance audit into your firm. My legal team is going to rip your sales division apart. We are going to expose your predatory pricing models, your unethical negotiation tactics, and the kickbacks you undoubtedly promised that procurement director. When my audit team is finished, Pinnacle Health will publicly sever all ties with your company, citing extreme ethical violations. No! Terrence begged, his arrogant facade completely and utterly shattered. He held up his shaking hands, a man watching his entire life disintegrate in real time. Gwen, please, you cannot do this. My firm will fire me. If I lose this contract, I am finished. They advanced me the capital to secure the Crestview mortgage. I leveraged everything on this commission. Everything. If you kill this deal, I am bankrupt. You are already bankrupt, I corrected him ruthlessly. You have been bankrupt for months. You just used a custom-tailored suit and a borrowed corporate credit card to hide it from your in-laws. The 18 guests murmured in shock. The wealthy real estate developer, the man who had previously toasted to Terrence's apex predator status, looked at him with sheer, unadulterated disgust. In their world, nothing was more offensive than a man pretending to have capital he did not actually possess. The social excommunication was instantaneous. Terrence was no longer a rising star. He was a toxic liability, a walking financial contagion. You lectured me about the killer instinct, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. You stood there drinking my father's expensive bourbon and told me that the medical supply industry is a shark tank. You told me that if I am not eating, I am being eaten. You demanded that I use the servant's entrance to your heavily mortgaged fantasy house because my presence might offend your fake millionaire neighbors. Terrence slid off the velvet sofa, his knees hitting the hardwood floor just at the edge of the Persian rug. The mighty, arrogant salesman was literally begging at my feet. Gwen, I am sorry. Terrence stammered, tears welling in his eyes, completely discarding every ounce of his manufactured dignity. I was stupid. I was showing off. I was just trying to impress William and Cynthia. Please, I am begging you. Do not execute the audit. Do not bankrupt me. I will do anything. I will clean your floors. I will do whatever you want. Please, Gwen. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no vindication. Just the cold, clinical satisfaction of excising a tumor. You should have maintained your silence, Terrence, I stated flatly. You should have enjoyed your Thanksgiving dinner. But you wanted to play God with my life, and you made the fatal mistake of challenging a woman who actually owns the universe you merely rent space in. I stepped back, turning my attention away from the pathetic weeping man on the floor. I had dismantled the brother-in-law. His career was over. His house was gone, and his social standing was permanently eradicated. But the execution was not complete. There was still one golden child left in the room who needed to be thoroughly, publicly shattered. I shifted my cold, unwavering gaze to my older sister, Allison. It was time to cure her of her illusions. Allison had pressed herself flat against the back of her velvet chair. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the armrests with such force that her knuckles mirrored the stark white of the fine china we had dined on earlier. She was watching her husband weep on the floor, her mind completely short-circuiting as she tried to process the total annihilation of her social standing. When my gaze locked onto hers, she physically recoiled. "And now, Allison," I said, my voice gliding smoothly over the quiet sobs of my brother-in-law. "Let us discuss your impending coronation. You spent the entire evening boasting about your promotion to senior partner at the Hawthorne Dermatology Institute. You claimed it was practically written in stone because your client retention rate makes you untouchable. You bragged about outworking everyone, functioning on 3 hours of sleep and treating your junior staff like incompetent peasants." Allison swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. She tried to summon her usual haughty demeanor, but her voice emerged as a fragile, reedy whisper. "My clinical record is flawless, Gwen. You cannot touch my medical license. I generate too much revenue." "Your clinical record is entirely irrelevant when your administrative foundation is owned by someone else," I countered, taking a slow step toward her. "You are remarkably oblivious for someone who claims to possess the predator gene. You assumed Hawthorne operated as an independent elite private practice, but your current managing partners have been drowning in administrative debt for the last 18 months. They were desperate for a corporate bailout to keep their luxury clinic doors open. I paused, letting the cold reality wash over her. Last Wednesday, the medical investment arm of Oasis Holdings executed a quiet, aggressive buyout. We acquired a 60% controlling stake in the Hawthorne Dermatology Institute. I am your new majority owner, Allison. I own the building, I own the equipment, and I effectively control your employment contract. Allison shook her head in rapid, frantic denial. No. The managing partners would have told us. They promised me the partnership. They promised you the partnership before I ordered a comprehensive disciplinary review of the entire clinic, I corrected sharply. When we acquire a new medical facility, we perform a ruthless audit of the Human Resources Department. Your personnel file, Allison, was an absolute horror show. It was a dense, staggering collection of formal complaints from nurses, technicians, and junior residents. You have systematically, verbally abused, overworked, and degraded lower-level staff for years. You created a highly toxic work environment because you genuinely believed your revenue generation made you immune to consequences. I leaned in just slightly, making sure my next words pierced straight through her golden child complex. As the majority owner, I personally vetoed your promotion yesterday morning. I permanently struck your name from the partnership track. Instead of a corner office, you are receiving a formal summons to an HR tribunal on Monday. Your career trajectory is completely frozen until I decide whether your abusive behavior warrants immediate termination. You are a pathological liar! Cynthia screamed, her voice shattering the heavy silence. She lunged forward, her face twisted in a mask of desperate denial. This is an elaborate psychotic fantasy. William, do something. Tell everyone she is lying. Tell them your daughter is just an envious house cleaner, making up insane delusions to ruin our Thanksgiving. William puffed out his chest, stepping in front of Cynthia. You have gone too far this time, Gwen, he bellowed, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. You march in here spouting fabricated corporate jargon and threatening your sister and brother-in-law with imaginary buyouts. I will not have my family insulted in my own home by a failure who sweeps floors. Show us the proof, or I will have you forcibly removed from the property immediately. I did not flinch at his hollow threats. I smoothly raised my smartphone, unlocking the screen with a single touch. I navigated directly to the secured Oasis Holdings executive portal. I held the bright display up for my parents to inspect. Here is the finalized deed for the Crestview Estates subdivision bearing my digital signature, I stated, my voice echoing with icy precision. I swiped to the next document. Here is the internal corporate email confirming the hostile takeover of the Hawthorne Dermatology Institute dated last Wednesday. I swiped one more time. And here are the official Securities and Exchange Commission filings definitively listing me as the sole founder and controlling shareholder of Oasis Holdings. The financial data is public record for anyone intelligent enough to look. Cynthia stared blankly at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth across the legal headers and authentic financial seals. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged as her brain finally processed the terrifying truth. Suddenly, a tall man with silver hair stepped out from the circle of terrified guests. He was my father's most crucial investor, the powerful man who personally funded William's lavish suburban lifestyle. He walked very slowly toward the glass coffee table, ignoring my parents completely. He reached down carefully and picked up the solid black metal business card I had dropped earlier for Terrence. The wealthy investor adjusted his reading glasses, his sharp eyes scanning the engraved silver text. He let out a sharp, audible gasp, the color completely draining from his face. His right hand began to shake as he looked from the heavy metal card straight up to me. "Oh my God!" the investor whispered, his voice trembling with sheer awe. "It is actually you. The rumors in the financial district always said the CEO of Oasis Holdings was a ghost, a reclusive billionaire who never attended public galas or gave media interviews. I have been desperately trying to secure a meeting with your acquisition team for 3 years." He turned and looked at my aging father with pure, unadulterated disgust. "William, you absolute monumental fool. You have spent the night treating a titan of industry like a common servant. The investor's declaration hit the room with the force of a localized earthquake. The physical reaction from the remaining guests was instantaneous and brutally clear. In the cutthroat world of elite Westchester society, loyalty is an illusion purchased with status. The moment that status evaporates, the social execution is swift. I watched as the 18 high society guests physically recoiled from Cynthia and William. It was a synchronized collective step backward. They were putting tangible distance between themselves and the toxic wreckage of my family. They recognized immediately that associating with people who had just publicly humiliated the billionaire CEO of Oasis Holdings was absolute financial suicide. The silver-haired investor did not wait for my father to respond. He placed his half-empty glass on the nearest side table and buttoned his suit jacket with a sharp, decisive motion. He looked at William with eyes completely devoid of the camaraderie they had shared just 30 minutes prior. "I will be contacting my legal team on Monday morning to dissolve our joint ventures," the investor stated, his voice ringing with cold finality. "I do not do business with men who are foolish enough to actively sabotage their own bloodline, especially when that bloodline controls the largest private equity firm on the Eastern Seaboard. Your lack of basic intelligence is a massive liability. Consider our professional relationship permanently terminated." William reached out a trembling hand, his face a portrait of sheer, unadulterated panic. He tried to grab the investor's sleeve, his voice cracking as he begged for a moment to explain. But the investor simply swatted his hand away and walked straight toward the front foyer to retrieve his coat. That single decisive exit triggered a massive chain reaction. The dominoes began to fall in rapid, uninterrupted succession. The other wealthy businessmen and their perfectly styled wives immediately followed suit. They abandoned their expensive wine glasses on the mantelpiece and left their gourmet desserts untouched on the dining table. Nobody offered Cynthia a polite farewell. Nobody thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner. They treated my mother as if she had suddenly contracted a highly contagious lethal disease. The women who had just been laughing with her about country club gossip now averted their eyes, pretending she did not exist. Cynthia stood frozen in the center of the living room, her hands hovering in the air as she watched decades of ruthless social climbing disintegrate into ash. She had built her entire identity on the approval of these people, and I had just erased her from their world with a single smartphone screen. As the front door clicked shut again and again, the living room emptied out, leaving only the suffocating reality of my family's total destruction. The departure of the audience removed the final pillar supporting Terrence's fabricated ego. He had spent the entire evening performing for those wealthy guests, desperate to convince them he belonged in their stratosphere. Now, with the audience gone and his financial ruin explicitly laid bare, the arrogant sales director completely shattered. Terrence let out a loud, pathetic sob. The sound was jagged and wet, entirely lacking the booming, aggressive timbre he had used to threaten me earlier. He pushed himself off the edge of the velvet sofa, his legs refusing to support his weight. He fell heavily onto the Persian rug, crawling forward on his hands and knees. He scrambled across the floor, completely disregarding the expensive fabric of his ruined trousers, until he was positioned directly at my feet. "Gwen." "Please," Terrence babbled, his face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer terror. His voice was shrill, desperate, and entirely stripped of human dignity. "I am begging you. You have to listen to me. I do not have anything. It is all a lie. Everything is a lie. I do not own the cars. The sports cars are on predatory leases. The designer suits are bought on credit cards that are completely maxed out. I am drowning. I am suffocating in debt. I just wanted to look like I belonged here. I just wanted William and Cynthia to respect me." He reached out his trembling fingers, hovering inches from the hem of my dress. He was terrified to touch me, treating me as if I were a volatile explosive. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and spilling over with frantic tears. "The down payment for the Crestview Estates house was not my money," Terrence confessed, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "I borrowed it from a high-risk private lender, a shadow loan with a 30% interest rate. I leveraged my entire life against that Pinnacle Health contract. If you execute that compliance audit on Monday, I will not just lose the house. I will go to prison for corporate fraud. They will uncover the falsified inventory reports. They will see the kickbacks. I will lose everything. My freedom, my marriage, my entire life. You hold my actual life in your hands. I looked down at the man who had just demanded I use the servant entrance to his fake mansion. He was weeping openly, tears and mucus shining on his face. The transformation was sickening to witness. He had no moral compass, no actual backbone. His entire personality was just a fragile shell painted with gold spray paint, and the slightest pressure had crushed him into dust. "Please!" Terence wailed, bowing his head until his forehead nearly touched the hardwood floor. "I will do anything. I will wash your cars. I will clean your offices. I will be your servant. Just do not sign the audit authorization. Just let the medical supply contract go through. Give me this one chance to survive. I promise I will never speak to you disrespectfully again. I will disappear. Just let me have the contract." I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, looking down at his pathetic, groveling form. I let the absolute silence of the room amplify the sound of his ragged, desperate breathing. I wanted him to feel the total weight of his helplessness. "You fundamentally misunderstand how my corporation operates, Terence," I said, my voice cold, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. "Oasis Holdings does not subsidize fraudulent, incompetent middlemen. We eliminate them. You built a kingdom on quicksand, and you chose to throw stones at the woman who controls the tide. I am not going to save you from the consequences of your own agonizing stupidity. The compliance audit proceeds on Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. I strongly suggest you spend the weekend finding a very good defense attorney." Terence let out a guttural, despairing cry and collapsed fully onto the floor, curling into a tight, trembling ball. He was finished. There was no recovery for him. I slowly shifted my gaze away from the broken man at my feet and directed my unwavering attention to the golden child. It was time for Allison to face the music. Allison was no longer standing tall. Her shoulders were hunched, her designer dress looking suddenly too large for her shrinking frame. She looked down at Terence, who was still whimpering on the Persian rug, and then back up at me. The realization that her entire life was entirely dependent on my mercy had finally bypassed her arrogant ego and struck her directly in the heart. Her flawless makeup was beginning to run as thick, heavy tears spilled over her eyelashes and tracked down her cheeks. "Gwen, please." Allison choked out her voice, a shrill, hysterical pitch that bordered on a scream. "You cannot do this to me. I have worked my entire life for that senior partner position. It is all I have. You cannot just take it away." "I am not taking anything away," I replied smoothly, my voice echoing in the hollow space left by the departed guests. "I am simply executing my fiduciary duty as the majority owner of the Hawthorne Clinic. Your administrative record is a massive legal liability. I am insulating my investment from the toxic work environment you actively cultivated." Allison shook her head violently, sending her highlighted hair flying across her tear-stained face. She spun around, physically turning her back on me, and directed her absolute unhinged fury toward our mother. Cynthia was still standing near the velvet armchair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to maintain some semblance of dignified composure amid the total wreckage of her family. "This is your fault!" Allison shrieked, pointing an accusing finger directly at Cynthia's chest. "You made me like this. You spent our entire childhood pitting us against each other. You told me I had to be perfect. You told me I had to step on Gwen to prove I was the best. You fed me this toxic garbage my entire life, and I listened to you." Cynthia recoiled as if she had been physically struck. "Allison, lower your voice immediately. You are being hysterical." "I am being destroyed," Allison screamed, her voice cracking under the immense strain of her collapsing reality. "My career is over. My husband is going to prison for fraud. We are going to lose our home. And it is all because you could not stop obsessing over your pathetic social status. You just had to push her tonight. You just had to try and force her to be your maid. If you had just kept your mouth shut, none of this would be happening." Allison collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, jagged sobs. The golden child had completely shattered, crushed under the weight of her own manufactured superiority and the sudden violent withdrawal of maternal protection. Cynthia stood frozen in the center of the room. Her husband was financially ruined. Her son-in-law was a weeping mess on the floor. Her golden daughter was publicly blaming her for the destruction of their entire family. She had absolutely no allies left. Her entire world had been reduced to ash in less than 20 minutes. I watched her eyes dart frantically around the empty living room, desperately searching for an escape hatch, a loophole, a way to spin this catastrophic disaster into a victory. And then I witnessed one of the most grotesque psychological pivots I had ever seen in my entire life. Cynthia physically forced her facial muscles to relax. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress and took a slow, deliberate breath. When she looked back at me, the manic rage and cold hostility were completely gone. In their place was a wide, beaming smile that radiated a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated maternal warmth. "Oh, Gwen, darling," Cynthia cooed, her voice dripping with honeyed affection. She took a step toward me, opening her arms as if she were about to pull me into a loving embrace. My brilliant, incredible daughter. I did not move. I did not blink. I simply watched the grotesque performance unfold with clinical fascination. "You completely misunderstood the entire evening," Cynthia continued, letting out a light, airy laugh that sounded completely unhinged given the carnage surrounding her. "I was not humiliating you, sweetheart. I was testing you. I was challenging you." William stared at his wife as if she had suddenly grown a second head. Even Terrence stopped crying for a fraction of a second to look up at his mother-in-law in sheer disbelief. The absolute audacity of her lie was staggering. A test, I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue like poison. "Yes, exactly," Cynthia beamed, clasping her hands together against her chest. "I always knew you had this fire inside you. I always knew you had the grit and the absolute brilliance to conquer the corporate world. But you were so quiet, so withdrawn. I knew that if I just pushed you hard enough, if I challenged your pride, you would rise to the occasion and show everyone what you were truly capable of. And look at you now. You are a billionaire CEO. My tough love strategy worked perfectly." The pure, unfiltered hypocrisy of her statement sickened every single person remaining in the room. She was entirely willing to sacrifice her own dignity, her husband's business, and her golden child's career if it meant she could somehow attach herself to my massive wealth. She wanted to claim credit for the empire I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. "You cut off my tuition," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "You canceled my phone plan. You told the security guards at your gated community to deny me entry when I tried to come home for Christmas 10 years ago. You told me I was a permanent stain on your pristine family lineage." "That was all part of the motivation, darling," Cynthia insisted, taking another eager step toward me. Her eyes were completely wide, manic, with the desperate hope that I would actually believe her twisted narrative. "I had to be cruel to be kind. I had to forge you in the fire so you could become the diamond you are today. And I am just so incredibly proud of you. You have to forgive your poor mother for playing the villain. It was all for your own good." I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I searched her eyes for a single ounce of genuine remorse, a single shred of actual maternal love. There was absolutely nothing there. There was only raw, naked greed. She did not care about the pain she had inflicted on me. She only cared that my bank account could elevate her social standing back to the absolute top of the Westchester elite. She wanted to ride my coattails straight into the billionaire class. "You are a psychological parasite," I said, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. "You do not possess the capacity for love. You only understand transactional value. 10 years ago, my value to you dropped to zero, so you threw me in the garbage. Tonight, you realized my net worth eclipses your entire existence, so you are desperately trying to crawl into my pocket." Cynthia's fake smile finally faltered. Her hands dropped to her sides, her manufactured warmth completely evaporating. There was no test. I continued stepping forward and forcing her to retreat. "There was only your cruelty, your arrogance, and your profound stupidity. You spent the last decade building a shrine to your own ego, and I just burned it straight to the ground." Do not ever insult my intelligence by attempting to claim credit for the fire. Cynthia's mouth snapped shut. The frantic energy that had animated her just moments before completely vanished, replaced by the hollow stare of a woman who had finally run out of lies. She looked incredibly small, standing there in her expensive silk dress, amidst the ruins of her carefully curated existence. William remained rooted to the spot, his broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, and he was currently watching the daughter he threw away dictate the terms of his family's utter destruction. I turned away from my mother, feeling a profound sense of liberation washing over me. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the Westchester estate no longer had any power to compress my lungs. I was not trapped in their toxic ecosystem. I was the architect of my own universe, and I was officially closing the gates. I walked slowly back toward the center of the room. My footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor, a steady drumbeat marking the end of my 10-year exile. I stopped at the edge of the glass coffee table. Terence was still curled on the Persian rug, his custom-tailored suit stained with spilled bourbon. He kept his face buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by the reality of his impending criminal audit and financial ruin. Allison remained frozen in her velvet chair, her tear-streaked face staring blankly at the wall, mourning the loss of her clinical empire and her golden child status. I reached down and picked up the cheap brass key with the plastic tag, the key Terence had so aggressively tossed at me, the key to the service entrance of the Crestview Estates mansion, the key that was supposed to symbolize my permanent placement at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The metal felt cold and insignificant against my palm. I walked back over to my mother. She instinctively flinched as I approached, her eyes darting nervously to my hands. She was clutching her half-full glass of expensive red wine, holding it against her chest like a fragile shield. I stopped mere inches from her, invading her personal space with the exact same aggressive proximity she had used to intimidate me earlier. But unlike her, I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. I simply looked at her with the cold, detached gaze of a stranger. I held my hand out, hovering directly over her crystal wine glass. I opened my fingers and let the brass key drop. The heavy metal splashed into the dark red liquid, sinking immediately to the bottom of the crystal flute. Drops of wine splattered onto the front of Cynthia's pristine silk dress, leaving dark, irreversible stains across the expensive fabric. She gasped, taking a sudden step backward, but she did not dare complain. She just stared at the ruined wine glass in her trembling hand, realizing that her ultimate prize was nothing more than a cheap, tainted illusion. "I am not your darling," I said, delivering the words with a quiet, lethal finality that resonated through the dead silence of the living room. "I am your son-in-law's creditor, I am your daughter's boss, and I am someone you will never see again." I did not wait for a response. There was absolutely nothing left for them to say. I turned my back on the weeping salesman, the shattered doctor, the disgraced patriarch, and the humiliated socialite. I walked straight toward the grand front entryway. I maintained my perfectly composed posture, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble foyer. I reached the heavy oak door, grasped the polished brass handle, and pulled it open, letting the crisp, freezing autumn air flood into the suffocating house. I stepped out onto the wide front porch. The driveway was completely empty of the 18 luxury vehicles that had been parked there just an hour ago. The only car remaining belonging to a guest was the rented Toyota sedan I had strategically parked near the entrance. I walked right past it. I reached into my designer clutch, pulled out the rental keys, and tossed them casually onto the hood of the cheap car. The rental company could send someone to retrieve it tomorrow morning. Waiting at the bottom of the driveway, idling silently in the cold night air, was a jet-black armored Maybach. My head of security had timed the arrival perfectly. As I descended the front steps, my personal driver stepped out of the luxury vehicle. He was dressed in a sharp, immaculate dark suit. He offered a respectful nod, opened the heavy rear passenger door, and stood waiting with absolute professional deference. I paused for one brief second before sliding into the plush leather interior of the Maybach. I did not turn around to look at the house. I did not need to see my family watching my departure through the living room windows. I knew exactly what they were experiencing. They were watching the family maid drive away in a vehicle that cost more than their entire retirement portfolio, escorted by staff who treated her with the genuine respect they had spent their entire lives trying to buy. The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing me inside the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of my vehicle. The driver smoothly navigated the massive car out of the suburban driveway, turning onto the winding, tree-lined road that led back to Manhattan. The transition from the rural darkness to the bright, glowing skyline of the city mirrored the immense shift in my own life. I leaned back into the soft leather seats and watched the affluent neighborhood fade into the darkness. For 10 years, I had carried the heavy, bruising weight of their rejection. I had let their cruel words echo in the back of my mind while I scrubbed floors, managed properties, and negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions. But tonight, I had finally handed all that heavy baggage right back to them. Building an empire in absolute silence is the most grueling, isolating experience a person can endure. It requires you to swallow your pride, ignore the mockery of small-minded people, and focus entirely on the foundation of your own future. People who are obsessed with loud, flashy displays of wealth will always underestimate the quiet, relentless dedication of someone building real power. Let them mock you. Let them call you a failure. Let them construct their fragile houses of cards while you quietly buy the land beneath their feet. Because when the time finally comes to reveal your hand, true success does not need to raise its voice. True success is the ultimate undeniable revenge. Have you ever had to silently endure the mockery of toxic relatives while quietly building your own success? Have you ever let someone underestimate you, only to completely shatter their reality when the time was right? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this journey of corporate retribution and family boundaries, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about claiming your power and walking away from toxicity. Remember, your worth is never defined by people who are too blind to see your potential. Keep building in silence and let your success make all the noise. The most profound lesson to draw from Gwen's journey is that true success and power do not need to shout to be heard. In a world that frequently equates human worth with loud performative displays of status and constant social validation, this narrative serves as a vital reminder that real strength is cultivated in absolute silence. While her toxic family wasted their energy tearing her down to inflate their own fragile egos, Gwen channeled her pain into the quiet, relentless grind of building a formidable empire. It is incredibly painful when the people who are supposed to protect and support you, your own family, become your harshest detractors. When faced with such profound betrayal, it is a natural human instinct to crave their validation or to immediately defend yourself against their cruel misconceptions. However, Gwen's unwavering stillness in the face of her mother and sister's relentless mockery demonstrates a masterful level of emotional control. She recognized a fundamental truth: arguing with individuals who are committed to misunderstanding you is a complete waste of energy. Instead of raising her voice to match their chaotic frequency, she let the undeniable, unshakable reality of her achievements speak for her. This story encourages all of us to reevaluate how we handle deeply toxic environments and relationships. When confronted with people who are determined to belittle your worth, the most effective response is to entirely disengage from their toxic narrative. You do not owe your abusers an explanation, nor do you need their permission to thrive. By focusing your energy inward and building your life strictly on your own terms, you permanently strip toxic individuals of their power over you. Share this reflection with someone who might be struggling with toxic family dynamics and commit to letting your own actions speak louder than your critics.